we had a recent one where somebody came up and they're a massive horror fan, and they said, as a horror fan, playing this game, I actually finally feel seen as a horror fan. Like somebody gets what we want, and understands that that's what that this is the experience that I've always wanted as a horror fan, to be on the tabletop, but it's just never been here before.
Now, you listeners know I am fascinated by how design partnerships work. In this conversation with Charlie from Parable Games, I learned how he and his brother Barney brought to life the Shiver Horror RPG. With Charlie, I have found someone who loves horror maybe even more than I do. I do have a soft spot for funky dice, streamlined mechanics, and die pools. So Shiver delivers horror with some of my favorite mechanics. Shiver is a game created to solve the problems Charlie and Barney had with D&D, and their design path is fascinating. How they tackled combat and their reaction system might fascinate you. Charlie has an interesting take on the history of horror cinema as a genre, and we get into it. But make sure you stick around until the end to learn about the inheritance system and how that brings the concept of slashers, a subgenre to horror, into Shiver. This episode, just like everything coming from the third floor, is only possible because of the support on Patreon from our patrons. I want to welcome a couple of our newest floor heads. Big thanks goes to Athios, Jonathan M., Borgie, Rasmus Peterson, Bokabard, Christopher Taylor, and Jonathan Brandenburg. Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy my time with Charlie.
Come on, guys. This game is taking forever. Whose turn is it? Oh, it's mine? Oh, sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Bruder.
And I'm Kristen O'Neill, and you're watching Disney Channel.
And when we're not making Thin Places Radio, we are listening to Tabletop Talk.
See you there. Okay, well, perfect.
Nailed it. Got it in one.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Today we're talking to Charlie Menzies of Parable Games, the creators of the Shiver RPG. Charlie is the lead writer and creator of Shiver. So Charlie, welcome to the third floor.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
So Charlie, there was a day where you didn't know you could grab a bunch of funky dice, put some numbers on a sheet of paper, roll those dice and pretend to be somebody else. And then you found it. So can we go back to the first moment that you became aware of this hobby?
So the first time I kind of got into tabletop role-playing games was when I was at university. I think it was probably my second year there. Definitely start of second year, where I'd moved out of general halls. I was with been living with the kind of 3 or 4 kind of close friends, and someone said I've really kind of wanted to GM Dungeons and Dragons. Do you guys all want to give it a go? And I was very much of just yeah, sure, why not? Never played it. Love video games, love board games. This sounds like a laugh, and absolutely loved it. Found it really, really fun. New GM was first time he'd ever GM'd, so it was a little bit. So we started with the starter set, and it was all a bit. So this is 5e. It was a little bit janky, but still quite fun. And then began seeking it out kind of more and more. I think for me, a big turning point was I was talking to my cousin Zach, who had been running D&D for a while. And I went and was a guest star in his regular home game, because our families don't live very far away at the time, and he was a fantastic GM. It's completely different from someone who's only just starting running the game. This is someone who's been running a game for 3 years, and at that point, I think I started to think, oh, actually, I would quite like to also run a game at some point in the future. However, that didn't happen for quite a long time, because being a university student, I was poor, desperately poor, and buying RPG books was not top of the list, and I was studying film and television, so quite often buying movies was top of my list at that time. But then after I left uni and we kind of our regular game kind of petered out when we were at university eventually, as well as we all got busy with our final year projects. about how long was it? About 4 months, 5 months maybe afterwards, I was experimenting doing some different things. We've been writing screenplays and making movies, and I wanted to try something else. So I was writing short stories. I was doing prose writing, and I won a competition with a Penguin random publishing house.
No kidding.
And gave me a £200 voucher, as well as some kind of like feedback and stuff on my writing. I thought, you know what? Because I was working in London at the time when I won the award. I was like, I really want to like play D&D and like get my friends together from university, some of them who weren't in my original game, and use it as a way to keep in touch with everybody and kind of, funny enough, like run an online game. So I burnt through that award money in one go on all the stuff I needed to run D&D.
Yay, Watsy!
And then also bought dice packs for all the people who are going to be in the group, and we went on holiday in the Peak District, and I think we were in like a yurt, and I ran like our first like 5 games in the so we went hiking in the day and then ran D&D in the evening, and kind of got everyone on board and playing the game, and then it just became a regular online game, and we kind of all fell in love with it. And that's kind of where I started GMing, and then at that point I was fully into the TTRPG kind of scene, as it were, in terms of playing and running games.
A couple questions for you on that, Charlie. So, you know, you get your first exposure to it. You have a mediocre first-time GM, God bless them, but, you know, didn't have quite the impact, it sounds like, the second GM. And then you go through this long period of time, several months or years, it sounds like, when you're finishing up university. But somehow that itch was still back there, enough that when you had some cash in your pocket, you said, you know what, I'm going to do this. Do you have a sense now, looking back, you know, why you, like, I'm sure there's been many things you've been exposed to hobby wise that you've looked at and go, yeah, that was fun, and you never returned to it, yet somehow you returned back to this. Do you have a sense of why that is, looking back?
I think in terms of hobbies, tabletop role-playing games grabbed me in a way that no other hobby has, simply because it really speaks to the kind of inner storyteller in me that I very, very much enjoy. And I've always seen my approach to tabletop role-playing games in general is that it very much evokes sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories or just general stories. I always have a bit of a spooky bent to it, hence a horror game that I've made. But of that kind of collaborative element of everyone throwing and pitching in and kind of having fun. And to be honest, it also evokes like a lot of the fun that I had when doing script sessions, screenwriting for film and TV, of where you're bouncing ideas around one another, but it gives you mechanics and has the pressure of the final products not needing to get optioned. And it allows you to have these actually play out these big cinematic moments and experience them, whilst the frustrated creative inside a lot of writers, I think, especially screenwriters, is that you'll write these scripts that are maybe slightly higher concept, but as a junior screenwriter, that's never going to get made ever. Right. Like it's such a far-flung dream. But TTRPGs allow you to bring people in who understand your kind of like style of storytelling, be characters, populate it, throw in their own ideas, and create this wonderful mixing pot of story. Regardless of genre, it just so happened that D&D was where I started, and I think that's what kept dragging me back to it. I mean, heck, the fact that I was writing prose fiction in order to get money to then got me back into the hobby is very much, it all circles around story, I feel.
So obviously you've been spending a lot of time, you know, creating games and writing for games. Do you still write prose? Do you still write screenplays, or is this pretty much your focus now?
I do. Much so he's not here, not for the chagrin of my brother, who'd probably be behind me with the stick, being like, "You need to focus." So I've taken a bit. So I have a number of like screenplays still banked. I've kind of stepped away from screenplays a bit now, simply because getting stuff kind of off the ground and moving it around and getting options and sold is hard, and it does require a lot of time and focus. Prose is a bit of a different one. So I have a collection of short stories horror short stories that I've been working on for about the past year and a half, 2 years, like in the background. Like, so whilst I've been doing Shiver, I've been developing that, hoping to maybe publish that at some point as well. So it's kind of that is something I still keep up with, because it still obviously influences how I write for the games. But I would say the games are very much the big focus still.
I mean, it's obvious to me, especially having, read the books, and, it's obvious to me where your cinematic background is evident in your game writing, right? That's finding out that's your background was no shocker. But what I'm interested in is has writing games changed how you write stories and screenplays? So has there been a bounce back? Has there been a situation now that, you've spent time creating and writing for Shiver, you go back to writing these short stories, you go back to looking at screenplays, and you realize that writing games has changed things for you, or not really? Has it been a one-way thing?
I think it's in terms of kind of impacting how I write. I'd like to think it's made me a better writer. In terms of, I think the way I structure and flow things for clarity is massive now. Like conciseness of sentences, I'm a bugger for a run-on sentence, which I think probably is still present in the core rulebook, I'm not gonna lie. But it's made in terms of that combination of like story, prose, but also mechanics, of also kind of making things clear but also entertaining. You're juggling so many balls when you're writing stuff for games of what you're trying to achieve, and then kind of bringing it back to prose, which is kind of very story character focused. It does feel quite different, but I think you become a lot more aware of your writing style for it. There's also a funny thing in terms of the separation of how you actually write stories. Of when you're writing stories for games, you're writing a framework for, especially for TTRPGs, this is, you're writing a framework with characters where players external to that will be the main protagonists. So you almost have to leave this void space that is going to be filled by people, and then populate all of the side cast, and try and figure out as many of the big options as you can imagine, so things kind of don't break but also feel satisfying. But yeah, it's this element of like the absence of protagonist is really interesting in a game, because ultimately you're writing characters and a framework in a game story in order to position people as protagonists and make them feel like they have, and in many cases, like have agency in the story and the story to change it. But you have to balance it with that most people who are playing aren't playing it with the same level of story instinct. So you have to kind of keep the level of agency that drives them forward in the plot to keep the story actually satisfying, like on the right direction, not on rails. Just clarify that for people, but in the right direction, that people are going to be satisfied in what they're doing. And then that reflects back really interestingly when you're writing prose, of where all of a sudden it's like you've got a protagonist and you have to, and sometimes I do get very used to abstracting protagonists out, so putting them back in can sometimes feel a bit weird.
That's interesting,
but it's quite refreshing. Going back to it and finding that and thinking about, and almost in a way like being like, if I was in this situation, or like people I know who I tend to kind of, how I work with protagonists is kind of keeping close to what I know, then it is like, how do they actually respond and work in those situations? Well, so you can't do that in a game, because if you're doing it for broader publication, those characters can be literally anyone, with various different play styles. So you have to keep things quite broad, which is it's a very interesting relationship between the two.
Yeah, I guess I've never thought about that. I mean, you're writing around the agents of chaos when you're writing a TTRPG, but you are literally writing the centerpiece of stories. Otherwise, it's a way I've never heard a phrase. That's fascinating. So you find D&D, you go to a yurt and you get to play with your friends. And it's funny that you say that, because I do a thing twice a year. I take a bunch of people out to the woods and we play board games during the day and we play RPGs at night. So I totally get that, because there's something neat about, like, we've got nothing else to do but play games, and that's incredibly refreshing. What was the next big game you came across? So if we see D&D as the first sign on your journey, what was the next game that really had an impact on you that you found?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. So when I was in the very early stages of Shiver developing it, I played Dread with friends and ran a game of Dread friends with the Jenga Tower. And that I think kind of really kind of stepped towards kind of, it was the closest thing that I was wanting to achieve of basically bringing a horror movie to the tabletop. When I played Dread, that feeling, that tension of having something physical and tactile, and a level of simplicity as well that was so accessible
Right.
for everybody. That was kind of my next kind of bigger one, I would say, before Shiver really ramped up and kind of that became a focus. I think there are other RPGs post that that have had a big impact as well in terms of the system, but also just very talented people running very good games of other systems as well. But I'd say before Shiver took off, Dread was definitely the next one. I think that very much cemented yes, definitely want to plow forward as being like a horror RPG and keeping that focus.
Yeah, it's funny. Dread and 10 Candles is another one that has that same type of thing where the physical props have just a huge influence on projecting the game, but which is just another mechanic, right? So that's fantastic. So guys, the Insider Insight series allows me to sit down with designers, developers, artists, writers, and creators and learn how they approach their work. I try and understand their process, inspiration, and methods for crafting their creations. We're going to be doing that with Charlie right after this break. Hey, it's me. I'm interrupting this episode, and I hope you're enjoying it, and I bet you're anxious to hear the rest. But before we jump back, I need a favor. Do you know someone who might enjoy this episode? Can you shoot them a quick message or maybe even send them a link to it? Listeners sharing this podcast was the primary reason we almost doubled our audience last year. Also, would you like to see and hear these games in action? Go to the Third Floor Wars YouTube channel and Twitch stream. Our actual plays combine compelling role-playing, character-driven action, and system tutorials. We create great stories while lifting the hood and showcasing the game mechanics. Links to both are in the show notes. Okay, last thing, and I mean it. Have you rated this podcast on your pod platform yet? Maybe even written a short review? It is a simple way for you to be even more awesome than you already are. Okay, now I'm done. Let's jump back and listen to the rest of this episode. So now, we already talked about Shiver a little bit. We're going to spend a lot of time right now on Shiver, but I do have a question because you're part of a partnership. You and your brother, are the main people that have been, involved with this game. There's several other people I noticed, in the credits, but really you two are the driver. Was your brother playing games at the same time, or did you introduce him to this, or how did that work?
So Barney's story is different to mine, but it's very interesting. So he left university and set up his own business straight. Well, to be honest, he was running his business in university. So he started trading Magic the Gathering cards. He was also a competitive player for a time. So that's where he started. And now he has his own online store and a friendly local gaming store, Seventh City Collectibles, which is just over the river from where I live now, funnily enough. So he runs that. So he kind of came off the competitive circuit eventually and focused more on the trading card element and all of that and kind of building that business up. But also we both played like Warhammer as kids together, and then I drifted away from the hobby. Bonnie drifted away a bit and then drifted back. I would say, but now he has through owning that store, he has contact with a huge amount of games, whether that's board games, role-playing games, card games in particular. I think was definitely his forte kind of starting out. But he's also plays RPGs, but I would say did not fall as deeply madly in love with them as I did.
Right.
He'd be the kind of person who would jump in and do a one-shot like every now and again when he had time, because he was very busy and still remains to this day heinously busy with his business. So it's kind of like balancing that with his time was a big thing. So that's kind of where he was at. So they were just they were kind of like running their online store and doing that whilst I was down in London, fiddling around with Shiver stuff. And there was kind of a confluence point because where Shiver came from is that I was running D&D with my friends, but I noticed there were some issues I was running into of that. Some of my friends are dyslexic or dysnumerate or dyspraxic, and they look at a D&D character sheet and it's massively intimidating, as are a lot of other systems. And it was a case of, I found a lot of the time I was almost running elements of their characters for them to try and smooth out things. I ended up developing a load of house rules to try and just bring down the crunch a bit and make things a bit easier and more accessible and more cinematic. Was really, I think, what we were all after. Pretty much the majority of people in that group being screenwriters was what it was. So they were all kind of after that element. And I thought, you know what, I really love horror games. I keep trying to put horror stuff into D&D. Why don't I come up with like a little mini system that we can play that's really easy and just have a laugh with? So I initially designed the base of Shiver as just a thing to play with my friends to fix a problem, to have a load of fun and play some cinema things on the tabletop. And then that Christmas, I came back up to the Midlands in the UK from London, and I had my notebook with me, where I was scribbling all stuff down. I was like, Barney likes games. Barney runs a game store. And we were just chatting, and I got my notebook and I showed it him, and he was reading through it, and I was just babbling away about all the different stuff we were doing. And he just turned around to me and said, "Oh, so when do you want to make it?" And I just went, I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "No, if you make this, like, I've not seen anything like this yet that covers it in this way. This is, and I'm not a horror fan, but I want to play this." And he says, and that says a lot. So, and we kind of went from there. And then, so I started working on it a bit more seriously, like dedicating a bit more time to it. And then eventually I got sick of working in London, and in the film industry, I got a bit burnt out, basically. Because I was working in like post-production for a big company doing various bits and pieces. But I got offered the job up in Nottingham, near my family, near where Barney's based as well. Working for a university, teaching film and TV and like tech stuff and doing bits. So I moved back up this way, and began working with Barney a lot more. The game progressed. We started doing play testing, and that really accelerated things because we were in the same place. So we had the ability to actually do that now, which when I was in London, we couldn't really do. And then the pandemic, and then 2 years, a year and a half into that, pandemic hit. And we were quite far along. We'd done a lot of testing. We'd finalized quite a lot of bits. It was just a case of, and by this point through playtesting, we discover Ben, our artist, who is someone who worked with Barney's partner, who Katie was talking about at work one day. Ben overheard. He loves D&D, loves RPGs, and he was like, "If you're looking for playtesters, I'd love to come along." And just a little side tangent of like how we found Ben. He came to a playtest. We were playing. We gave the system to somebody else to run a game to see what would happen, and they ran From Dusk Till Dawn from the perspective of the people in the diner that get shot up from the Gecko Brothers, and you go after the Gecko Brothers, which was really interesting. Nice. Which was a really interesting idea. And he was playing a English motorbike gentleman who was basically like Tom of Finland, leather, cap, bare-chested, bike chain, and it was this brilliant character. But the thing that we noticed is that throughout the thing, he was doodling, and he'd doodled his character, and it looked amazing. And then he doodled things that were happening, like listening and being really engaged, but like just loved drawing little things and slipping them to people. And it was just so much fun. And he just said, and he'd be like, "Oh yeah, have you ever looking for people to like look at doing some illustration or stuff like that?" And I think this would be really fun. We're like, okay, and then started putting a Fish Dev thing together with Ben. And then as soon as we kind of landed on the style with Ben, we were like, this is Shiver. This is how we want it to look. Yeah. It's and we've been working together ever since. Like he's full time now with us, illustrating everything that we do. Yeah.
And his work is brilliant. I got to tell you, it definitely invokes a very clear sense that this is a unique game. because it's such a unique and effective style. But that's fascinating that's how you came across it. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. I want to go back to you struggling with D&D, trying to do this. You say, you know what, I want to put together just a little something silly with my friends. And, I'm always fascinated when creatives end up creating to solve problems, right? It sounds like exactly what you did. You identified some challenges, maybe a better way to put it than problems, some challenges you're having with D&D, and you end up creating something new. If I went back and let's say I broke into your house tonight and stole that notebook where you had the initial sketches, the ones that you brought to Barney, what were the things very early on that you created, and what problems were they solving?
So the basis of where it started was the D6 dice pool system. Was it where it was like no numbers, symbols representing the core skill areas? That was the big. As soon as I had that, it was a I remember when it happened. I was watching Cabin in the Woods and looking at the archetypes that they have kind of in the end sequence. Spoilers for anyone who's not seen it. Like on these big pillars, and it kind of got me thinking about storytelling and how we talk about certain characters in terms to strengths in terms of their skills in terms of D&D. And I thought, what if you just tied a bit like a core skill area to a archetypal character that you find in all stories, and kind of went from there, and then did a rough sketch of some weird symbols, which aren't the final symbols, but they were what I gave to our graphic designer who came on freelance to do the symbols, was Ryan Walker. He's brilliant, and gave him that mad section of my notebook eventually, and he made them miles better. But that was the core of it. So where I started out with it is I got a bunch of blank dice and coloured dots, and started with coloured dots and just did that first, and then roll tested it by myself, and had to play around with it. Then I discovered, was it Roll My Dice, where you could do like custom dice and some elements, and then uploaded my symbols onto that, and then made it so, and then sent those to my friends, and then they could roll using that. And we played that way for ages, because we didn't have physical dice. So like colored dot dice and those apps were the places that I went. At this point, I didn't know that Edge of Empire existed. Was one of the things when I was looking at symbolic dice. And I realized, but now I do, and I've talked to people about it, because it kind of came when we launched the first Kickstarter. We discovered it, and I realized there was another problem that I was looking at but not realizing I was doing it, is that these symbols evoke something, because this is something that somebody threw out to me to explain why there have been some issues with Edge of Empire, bar the whole, there's a lot of controversy about the dice from what I understood, but when I see a symbol for the Rebel Alliance on a dice, it doesn't evoke anything for me in terms of story. What does it mean to me? I see a fist, like the grit symbol for Shiver. I know I'm going to do something big, strong, and I'm probably going to punch a fella. And it very quickly gives you a sense of like what's happened when you roll your dice. So and that was something I kind of wanted from the get-go, of like, you roll a bunch of dice, you see a bunch of color, a bunch of matching shapes, and you're like, Yahtzee, I've done it, but without any maths filtering in. It was very anti-maths, basically. It was just mathematics, get out of here, don't want it. Because that was where the big issues we were having playing D&D were coming from, were the pluses, the minuses, the modifiers to the dice, and then also the fact that when you roll a d20 and you see a 15, for a lot of players, that evokes nothing for them. They don't know what that means. In the case of my players, they had no idea what that meant. It's only with a D20 system, and this isn't just me ragging on D&D. I feel a bit bad, but it's but it's like, the things that evoke things for people are extreme failure and extreme success. So you roll a 1, that evokes something. I've effed up. I'm doomed. Which will come back later. As like 20. I've done amazing. Critical success, which are both really good feelings in D&D, is what I would say. They're both brilliant. They're both very, very strong. The issue I was finding is everything in the middle ground, which statistically is much larger. So the idea with the symbolic dice is that even if you got a mixed success and rolled a load of stuff, the symbols evoke things, so it would tell a story to you, or provide a story, or lace a narrative on them. We ended up calling that reading the knuckle bones in the system. But that was the starting point, was the D6s, the symbols evoking a story and evoking character through rolling.
So, and I'm going to pause for just a second, because one, there's people that maybe aren't familiar with Shiver. So I'm going to read your blurb on Shiver, and then I want to talk a little bit more about the mechanics, because I came across when Shiver Gothic came out. That's when I found you guys. I signed up for the Kickstarter, and then you just recently did your double feature. I couldn't sign up for that fast enough after reading, Shiver Gothic and so on and so forth. But just very quickly, but I want to talk about these because the dice mechanics is when you got me. So the art drew me in, the theme drew me in. And I was like, ooh, funky dice. I like funky dice. I'm one of the, everybody else complains about it. I'm a huge fan of funky dice. And then I started reading the mechanics of how you test. And I was like, I've never seen this before, which at this point is not easy. So I want to talk about it more. So very quickly, let's talk about Shiver. Shiver is a tabletop role-playing game that lets players bring their favorite scary movies, spooky TV shows, and horror stories to life. Ever wanted to play through the plot of your favorite film on the tabletop, or wanted to make sequels, prequels, and original stories in the worlds of pop culture you love? So cinematic, right out of the gate in your description. And so let's talk about test. Okay. So we have attributes, right? Every character has attributes, and let's start with just grit as our example. So what is a good grit for a character to have?
So with Shiver, there are kind of 7 character archetypes, and they all align to a core skill area. So for grit, the archetype's the warrior, and they're probably going to have the best grit in a group that you're playing as. So they'll have 5 core skill points and 1 talent point. So what that means is Shiver's a dice pool system. So the 5 core skill points are 5 D6s. Each side of the D6 correlates to the 6 core skill areas. So each side has a colourful symbol on a side. So you'd be rolling 5 of those. A talent die is a D8 that you get when you're very, very good at something, when you're talented at it. On those dice, there is a kind of a different skew of symbols. We have our talent symbols, which are a 5-pointed star that are a universal success for everything that isn't strange, which is a mixture of weirdness, failure, doom, fear, all of that business. It's got a lot of interesting mechanical stuff around it, but that is the only one that's abstracted. All the other 5 skills are a success on there. So I'd be rolling 1 of those as a warrior as well. So then, say I'm making a grit check to kick down a door, for example, classic check. I would roll my 5 core skill dice on my D6s. I'd roll my 1 talent die as well, and I'd be looking for the orange fist that represents grit, or the universal success, the talent symbol, which is a star. So I'm looking for stars and fists. And the more I roll, the more successful I am. So if it's a flimsy door, the way that checks work in Shiver is everything has a challenge rating. So if it's a flimsy door that's rotting off its hinges, probably only going to be challenge rating 1. I only need 1 correlating symbol to get through. If it's an iron door with big old bolts and a bulkhead kind of wheel on it, that's going to be really hard. It might be CR3 or CR4, which means I'm going to need 3 or 4 symbols in order to make a dent in that door. And that's the crux of it, is the more symbols you roll. So if you roll your pool and you see it light up orange with lots of fists, you know you've done well. If you see it light up purple with lots of strange, you've probably not done very well, and something bad might happen as well.
Well, what's fascinating about it for me when I read it, it was like, okay, so I get the, the narrative dice, feel to it, right? That we have in Edge of Empire, or was it 3rd edition Warhammer, then later became Genesis. Also get a little bit of the year 0 engine, right? Where if you are rolling a symbol, it counts as a success. So the more dice you roll, the better chance you have of it. What was unique is the attachment that the character has to a specific symbol. And what was interesting to me, and you've already spoke about it, is that, because of the color and the symbol, it immediately evokes a success or not, right? So it's read faster than I think any other die system I've ever come across. And there is that visceral reaction. And I think it's interesting that each archetype has different symbols. So you still mathematically have the same chances, but it's evoking a different thing. Now, what about other symbols, right? So let's say that I roll that check you just said. I roll my 5 die plus my 8-sided die. And let's say I get three of the grit symbols, the fist symbols, all right? And that equals my challenge rating. What show up on the other dice mean anything?
So there are other consequences for other symbols on the dice. So in terms of your roll there, if you've rolled 3 grit and you've succeeded, that's good. You succeeded. If you've rolled any strange, which we'll get into in a minute, that's negated because you've succeeded. The other element is if you roll any luck, which is one of the core skill areas because everyone needs luck to survive in a horror movie. You can bank that luck. So the way that mechanic is really simple, whether you succeed, whether you fail, when you roll your dice pool, if you see a luck symbol, you take one of your dice, you put it to one side, and before you do your next check, you can say, I'd like to spend my luck, and throw that into the pool. You can only bank one at a time unless you're the fool who has an archetype that specifically operates around luck and can bank lots of luck. But don't want to get too deep into it. But that's like on the positive side of like what you can kind of get with your dice pool. If you say you'd whiffed it and you've rolled no grit symbols and you've rolled a bunch of strange, say 2 strange symbols, for example, that has different consequences. So when you fail a roll and you roll strange, that ticks up minutes on the Doom clock, which is our narrative device that we have. That is a 60-minute clock, which can be tracked along the top of our director screens and on the third page of the character sheet as well. And the way that it works is that at 15-minute markers, bad things happen. They usually represent these big cinematic horror movie moments that would occur in a film to make audiences jump out of their seats, and in this case, harry the players and seed some terror amongst them. So I use a slasher movie as an example quite often with this. So like you're a bunch of say you're a bunch of camp counselors. It's summer 1970s. The classic setup. You buy a lake. You hit 1:15. All the power in the camp goes out. You go and investigate. Somebody has slashed the fuse box. At 1:30, things are getting a bit weird. You've done a bit more investigating. Some people have gone missing. Maybe you found like a murdered raccoon. I don't know, like signs of ill portent. You think we need to get out of here. At 1:30, you go to the school bus and somebody has fully sabotaged it. It was a bit of a rickety mess anyway, but now it is fully beyond repair. So you can't use it to escape anymore. At 1:45, you hear a scream in the distance. You come to find like a streak of blood leading off into us, and camp counselor Kenny has been murdered, has disappeared. A key NPC who potentially had valuable information, who could help you in a fight, is now just dead. They are gone. They are no longer in the story because you messed up. And then at midnight, it's a more permanent, mildly apocalyptic event. So in this case, it's your Michael Myers, your Jason Voorhees, your Freddy Krueger coming out of the woods and becoming a permanent stalking threat. Because if the players aren't going to end the story, the slasher very much is the idea. So it's every time you roll dice, the idea with this was for me is that I can't remember who said it, and it always bugs me that I forget this, is that dice rolls should be saved for tension. I'll eventually remember who said it, but and that stuck with me. And on that front is that every time you roll dice and Shiver, no matter how many dice that you're rolling, there's still a statistical chance that you're gonna mess up, and potentially you're going to roll a lot of strange. So you get this evoke kind of feeling of like sometimes you can, and it has an interesting amount of scale of that. The more dice you roll, actually, the bigger the failure can be. Sometimes of that. Statistically, it's more likely you'll succeed. But if you fail and then you roll 5 strange and that dice pool just lights up purple, all of a sudden something terrible can just happen. So it generates a really nice thing on the Doom clock where you're a minute away from an event where players are sweating, deciding whether they want to do what action they're going to do next, if they're playing to their strengths, whether they should do something that would prompt a roll because it might trigger something bad. And it just kind of builds this lovely horror-filled, like tense atmosphere that rolling always has a consequence for good and for worse.
Well, and an extension of, and I now you said that, I forgot who said this because I've heard that mentioned before, the tension piece there, and I can't remember who said it either. But something that my good friend Anthony will often say is it's actually a moment where tension's released, right? So you build up, you build up, you build up, and then you roll the dice. And that's when we find out what happens. And it again can invoke all kinds of things. And, you said, there's not a whole, I got rid of the math. I disagree. There's some fascinating math in your die system. It's just the players don't have to do it, right? The players don't have to, get a degree in Rollmaster in order to play your game. But I feel like I'm skipping over something important here. And I want to go back a little bit again, which is the dots on the blank dice. We kind of magically just George Lucas screen wiped to you struggling with the modifiers and everything in D&D and going, that's a problem, to suddenly, okay, I've got dots on dice and I've solved the problem. But something happened in between there. And I'm trying to understand, especially because you had not been playing role-playing games since you were 8 years old. You hadn't played 15 other different systems. You were a bit of a neophyte coming in there from the design standpoint. And you may not even remember, but what was that thought process that bridged you over to what became a very unique die system? Do you remember?
I think because it definitely fed into kind of how I wrote about it in the book in the end. I think This is the weird thing, and I think it surprises people, is that, yeah, you're right. Like, my entry into role-playing games was late, and I didn't have a crazy amount of experience with various kind of dice systems and things. Where my brain went was I was thinking about, ultimately, I want to use RPGs to tell a story with my friends, and people like the clickety-clack interactive element of it determining what their fate is. Basically, that's how I've always seen it, is that there's an element of destiny in terms of you rolling dice to figure out what's going to happen to your character, especially in horror. So it's this, and there was always this imagery, like in horror and also fantasy, of the kind of stooped crone gathering up like the pieces of bone and throwing them across the table, and them all having different shapes and different orientations, and they all mean different things. And I think it came from that, but then I just thought,
interesting.
Rather than having like, a crab claw, a mouse's skull, and a couple of human knuckle bones, what if I just took dice and I kind of took those meanings, distilled them down to an essence of character, and then placed them on the dice so that they told a story? Because I think that's the other side of the dice and not really talked about, is that I also, one of the things I hated, I'll use that strong word, as from running games in particular. And again, I use doors again as another example, because doors, I think, are the bane of everybody's bloody life in an RPG for some reason. It's because they present a simple obstacle that for some reason, I don't know exactly why, they have just created like the ultimate road test, in my view, for how a system operates and like overcomes a problem, especially simple as opening a door. Is a thing, or figuring out opening a door. And kind of like when I was thinking about that, is like the issue I was running into with, I feel bad, I feel like I'm smashing it, but D&D again, like was my main one, is that someone would be like, there is a locked door in front of you, trying to handle, you can't open it. Okay, I would like to lockpick the door. Okay, roll your check to lockpick the door. Try and roll to lockpick the door. They fail. Okay, someone else approaches the door. I'd also like to try and have a go at lockpicking the door. It's like, okay, fine, yeah, go for it. It's like, you're a barbarian, but hey, why not? It gets bone out of their necklace and tries to lockpick the door. Fails. It's like the wizard. I'd like to lockpick the door. What with? I'm just gonna get, it's a roll, isn't it? And it's just fine. And what you suddenly get is this comedic scene of 5 adventurers stacked to the nines with weapons, fiddling with a lock like they've forgotten their keys on a night out, and it kills immersion, it kills story, and it drove me crazy. This whole thing of roll spamming is kind of what I do. But my brother actually described it in a really good way. That actually pulls from a different part of our childhood, which is video games. And he calls it the Zelda pot smashing effect. of basically like, if you put something there, it's like basically people will be like, if they think they can interact with something, they will grab it, they will shake it, they will smash it, and they will do something with it. And doors always present that problem because doors are there to be opened and to be closed. And if a door is shut, someone will try and open it. And if they can't open it, then they'll keep rolling and trying things until they manage to do it. The issue is that for all of those fails and all of those people rolling lockpicking checks, as funny as that is, there is no consequence to failure. Mostly the consequence for failure comes from the GM getting frustrated and going either to hell with it, the door's open, you manage to get it open, or you break your lockpick off in the door, you can't open this door, please leave the door alone. It's and that's usually how it ends, or it's just being like, the only way you're going to get through this door is through brute force as well, and that's it. And it doesn't really, and it just slows things down, and it caused a lot of frustration. It's be a thing about me having a vendetta about doors now, but my point is that with the dice system in Shiver, if you roll your dice pool to get into a door in a specific way, so let's go back to the grit example again. You roll it to try and kick it down. So say I whiffed it, I didn't get any grit, but I roll 4 smarts, for example. As a director, so our version of the GM, I might say, you stubbed your toe, you take 1 blunt damage as you're hopping around because you didn't manage to kick the door open. However, as you're hopping around, you begin to look down and have a look around the area, and you notice that someone has hidden something under the mat, or there's a slightly loose brick. Because smarts is used for deductive thought for investigation in Shiver. Right. Another one, on the flip side of that, like say somebody wants to try and lockpick the door and they roll a wit check, for example. If they whiff that and rolled a load of grit, I might say, well, you slip on the doormat and you headbutt the door. You take 1 blunt damage, but you've bashed the door down, but you've made a load of noise.
Yep.
Or my favorite, like you rolled a load of strange and you fail at opening the door in any way, but then a bouncer opens the door and they start a combat with you because you're trying to break in. It's so the dice provide a fell forward mechanic, but they're almost like a improvisation prompt that's rolled out in front of you. So. Very much like that idea of that stoop crone, bones in hand, throwing them across the table, going, "This is your fate." But that invites both sides of the table to role play in different ways. So it's like the director can suggest, like, so if you roll a load of smarts, being like, do you think there's like an intelligent way that your character might get around this problem? What do you think happens? Or a player might actively make a suggestion, and you know what? The director goes, that's great, I love it. We'll proceed with the story that way because it's an unintended and interesting consequence that is keeping us on our toes, it's unexpected, and it's collaborative. And for me, that it just keeps the story momentum, the narrative momentum, always moving forward, always ticking over. So there's no dead time, like narratively, where it's the people twiddling their thumbs, like whilst people roll and roll and roll and roll, trying to achieve one thing. When it's rather than let them achieve the one thing or completely have that binary mindset with it, is let the dice guide you in taking the story in a way that neither side of the table expected, but ultimately is going to be a lot of fun.
Well, and your system does something that I really like in some other systems, but it, again, does it very uniquely, which is the dice don't just tell me what happens, but they give me insight on how it happened. Whether it be a success or a failure, which I think is very, very interesting and does provide us the opportunity for everybody at the table to be surprised, right? Where suddenly go, oh, well, maybe this has happened. And, you know, you get a little bit of writer's table that happens at, you know, during that moment. And I think that's fantastic. So you show this to your brother. Your brother says, you know, all right, we need to make this. What was your first reaction? We joked a little bit that you're like, what? Like at what point can you remember the moment where either you, your brother, or the both of you said, I think we actually are going to make this. This isn't just this little side thing. It's just not a sketchbook or anything. Let's really make a go at this. Do you remember when that happened and why that decision was made?
I think the thing that there's a split there. I think of kind of like when we really started pursuing it and when it really, really felt like a reality. And I think for me, when it really felt like a reality was when we had our first major play test with a bunch of different people, like some people who Barney knew, but I didn't know very well. And he was like, I'm going to drop you in deep end. I know these people, they're really nice, but they'll give you very honest feedback. A lot of them are veteran D&D players and other system players as well that you've not played. Run it, because I know you've written, and I had a starter story, which is in the Cursed Library, which is the Lost Ship, which is the first one I ever wrote. Ran that one, and they loved it, and they had a bunch of notes. They had things that they found really interesting. At this point, I was using the color dot dice, and that kind of really cemented me, because at that time I was like, oh, I'm not a game designer. I know nothing about games. Like, I've just played games, and, you know, my background's in this, and I just did this as a fun thing. But then kind of seeing people who were kind of veterans on the scene jumping in and being like, this is really fun. Like, if you tweak this slightly, or maybe playing around with this slightly, that could be really, really good. And then when we got into the regular playtesting, it was kind of like, yeah, no, this is a real thing. I mean, the imposter syndrome still loomed heavily.
Sure.
I mean, it still does. I think
never goes away. Yeah,
it never fully goes away. But I think as you kind of rightly observed, like, my late entry into the hobby did make me feel quite outsidery in terms of as a creator. Because it was the kind of thing I was like, I don't have the bona fides of that. I've not been playing D&D since I was 12, or being really ingrained in this. But I do feel that has brought something different to Shiver, is that my design wasn't coloured by outside influence as much, by not being as ingrained. I kind of was like, I enjoy this, and I enjoy telling story with friends, and I want to approach it this way, and didn't know as much about that as the things I do now. But now it's kind of the odd thing of like trying to not let that kind of color my thought process, and kind of keep it, seeing what my unique position in the industry now can bring to the table, and trying to kind of focus on that, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And it brings, like I said, when I first came across the Kickstarter and started digging into this thing before I couldn't give you my money fast enough, there was a freshness that I really enjoyed. And it's across the whole game. So we're focusing on the dice mechanics, but again, the art has no game looks like your game, because of what Ben is doing there. And so it's very fascinating for me to hear how he got there, and why did that invoke that feeling in me, and to understand the history behind that. Now, as we go through the process of you starting to sand the corners, starting to build a scaffolding of this game and turn it into what it became, what I keep hearing from creators is it's not this linear diagonal line from start to finish, that we just kept getting better and better and changes. I keep hearing about these plateaus where, you go flat for a while, and then you change something and it makes a huge jump, right? A huge jump in the iteration process. And I'd be curious now, again, looking back at it, what were some of the big jumps that happened to you in the design process that gave us where we ended up now?
So the introduction of the talent die, to the archetypes of like, this is where you are talented, vastly improved the feel of the game, because it also changed the way that players played the game, because it was like, if you are a warrior and you're really strong and buff, you literally play to your archetypes. You play to that archetypal character that you find in a horror movie. You are going to play the big dumb jock, because ultimately that is what you're good at. And that is almost your character's purpose in the story as well. And by adding the talent die, it provides incentive in terms of success, because of the huge statistical weight that it gives. For people succeeding, and feels really good of being like, oh, I'm really good at this. I get to roll the fancy dice as well, which is another little psychological element of it that we noticed. Yeah. And so that was a big jump, I think, of when we got away from just D6s, because I think originally we had it being more D6s, and then we pulled the numbers back down, so the amount of dice you were having to manage wasn't as crazy, and brought in the D8, and that really, really kind of helped things out. And then it was just balancing the statistical skew on the D8, which took a little while. And then we kind of got out of realizing that actually strange powers are more powerful, so that needs to actually lose a symbol, and the universal success, because there are 5 other characters that rely on it, or 6 other characters, I should say, and that the strange can actually take that hit in the heel, because it's already
interesting,
powerful and dangerous in the way that it operates. because sometimes they don't always roll and do things. So it's quite interesting. So that was a big one. Combat was the most frustrating bloody plateau in the whole process, because it was my biggest gripe with D&D, and it was me desperately trying to make it not feel like it, but there were elements that were very difficult to get it away from it feeling muddy. So I think sorting out limiting the action economy to move, attack, interact, and being that is it, and being that is how it's explained. That really clarified things for people massively. The big one, that was a really late addition to the game, like just before we launched a Kickstarter, funnily enough, was monsters didn't feel scary enough. And I had this problem in other systems as well, being like, how do we make it feel dangerous to attack something? How do we make it feel like this we don't know what this creature is going to do? And that's when we came up with the idea of like, what if when you hit something, there's a chance it could do something just completely random? And then that birthed the reaction system, which again was something looking around, we didn't really see that anywhere else. And we thought, how fun would that be if that the more dangerous something is, the more it reacts, and then that birth and being like, but different enemies behave in different ways. So you're trying to figure out which table it is, and then big enemies have their own unique tables, and it just got spiral, and then that basically added 8 more pages to the book of stuff. But then also a whole new system for how enemies behave. And as soon as we put that in the game, it was another thing that changed player behavior. Of that, someone hits a werewolf with a baseball bat, and it picks the jock up by the throat and suddenly throws them for a bookcase. But then somebody else attacks them and it doesn't do anything. And then somebody else attacks them and it bites somebody. And it howls at the moon, and everyone's suddenly terrified. It's a lot of people being like, how do I approach it? Is it best to wail on it as hard as possible and kill it quickly? Is it better to drop back and use ranged attacks? Is it better just to run away because the reactions are more dangerous than its base attacks, which is another thing with the two things, is that actually their base attacks aren't crazy powerful, but if you trigger its reactions, they're deadly. So actually engaging on an offensive way with it without depowering it in some other story-based fashion is killer. And as soon as we did that, it's like, now it feels like horror combat. Now it feels up against the wall.
That's great.
Without having to, up damage, do a lot of number shifting. It was more about the unpredictability of behavior rather than statistics. We did some balancing of stuff, of course, with enemies hitting harder, but it was more to do with just that queasy feeling a player will get if they're going to swing an attack, especially a close ranged attack, at an enemy they've not encountered yet. But also kind of added this interesting puzzle element as well, which engaged different corners of our player base in a new way, because it gave a layer of tactics that was very different, and then instantly I think made it feel very different from other RPGs in terms of its combat.
Yeah. Another thing that I find interesting is as the fence gets larger. Right. So the fence started just in your head, right? It's just you and your notebook, and you're playing around with this thing, and then you introduced it to your friends, right? Just you running the game, and then, you show it to your brother. Your brother says, now we're going to hand it over to people that's not you, right? And they're going to do it. And the fence keeps getting wider. Well, eventually the game comes out. And not only is the game out there, but you're not even in the room anymore. And I'm always interested to hear what bounces back to you. What was there anything that you heard, any feedback you heard, reactions to the game that you heard that really surprised you on either end of the spectrum? So praise that you were just like, wow, I wasn't anticipating that, or they saw something in the game I didn't even know was there, or was there people that struggled with the game that surprised you? What surprised you once it was out in the wild?
I'll start with the negatives and build into the good. I think that's a good way of doing it. I knew that symbolic dice were controversial. I did not realize the level until we released the game. It's not been too bad, but the level of vehemence that some players have for symbolic dice.
Some people hate the funky dice, man.
And it's like, we've made a free dice roller. Like, everyone can play the game. You don't need to buy anything if you want to play it. And there's dice conversions and stuff as well. This isn't me just like desperately trying to defend my own game. But it just, I think, again, this slightly outsidery element that I hadn't been ingrained in the community long enough to know that. Right. And that was quite sharp. I kind of felt that a little bit. I think some people found character creation. Some people didn't like the ability trees because they felt it felt too video gamey. But to me, that's something I've worn on my sleeve of that. Actually, I love video games, and I think that's something that they're doing right. Like, I think that really, really works. But that's been a small. I would say that's a smaller group. I have a lot of other group who say that makes it so much easier to build a character to them because it's a visual flowchart of how these things work rather than it being buried in columns of text. Other things. I'm just trying to think of if there's anything more recent as well, which is quite interesting. An interesting one that came from our community recently is somebody wanting to hear examples of playthroughs that are more serious in tone, which fascinated me. Because, I mean, to be fair, the ones that we've put out, they always devolve into horror comedy no matter what I do anyway. But I think that's just from reading the book, Hope You Felt This, is that I've quite a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor, like in the way that I write and the way that I'd like to approach things. And for me, you can't really do horror without balancing the dark with some light. Even if it's just a glimmer, it needs to be there. Otherwise, it's just misery. In my opinion, and it's not as fun an experience. So that's been quite interesting and trying to figure that out. In terms of positives, some things that really surprised me, some of these quite recent ones actually, is because we started going to conventions now. So obviously now we're out in a pandemic, and so we've maybe done about 6 or 7. So we're getting our kind of sea legs on for it a little bit more. We had a recent one where somebody came up and a massive horror fan, and they said, as a horror fan playing this game, I actually finally feel seen as a horror fan. Like, somebody gets what we want. And understands that's what that this is the experience that I've always wanted as a horror fan, to be on the tabletop, but it's just never been here before, or it's always been a niche corner, and that blew me. And I almost cried. It was I was a bit like, I bet it was. I was so shocked because for me, my experience,
that's a validation right there.
There's an interesting split, I think, kind of in our player base, of that there are RPG gamers and they're big horror fans, and then there's a lot of crossover kind of in between. And the horror community, I think, is maybe one that people know a little less about, but I think there's so many lovely people there, and it's the kind of thing, and it's the old adage of that comedy writers are usually depressed and sad, and horror writers are usually the nicest, most lovely people you've ever met. I think of Junji Ito for all of his horror mangas is possibly the sweetest man alive, but also like writes and draws some of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. And it's I feel that way about the community a lot of the time, and like hearing that in terms of like less of a kind of game design thing of just like making people feel like their hobby, their interests are being seen and heard and interacted with, and being like, this is a fun, good thing. Like, actually, because horror's got an interesting history. I mean, I'm going to go off on a little bit now, but in terms of the film history with horror has always been very outsidery. It's been very much. It's been banned. It's been prohibited. Its fans have been lambasted. There's a whole people have like labeled it like smut, illegal, gore. I mean, like in the UK alone, like we have a big history with the whole Mary Whitehouse, the video nasty era in this country. Coloured a lot of things. I mean, it's before my time, but the echoes of it you can kind of still feel. And we're finally hitting a stride, I think, in cinema in particular, where horror is gaining validation, it's gaining recognition, and it's gaining the love and respect that it actually deserves. That not only can it be really fun and really entertaining, but it actually is a desperate social lens we need on our world in order to understand it. And I think there are so many people who have been so interested in it for so long, but unlike other hobbies, they don't talk about it so profusely, or didn't maybe 5-10 years ago, because it was slightly taboo or like seen as in this a term I hate, and I ran into it when I was at university, labeled it as trashy.
Right.
But that's not the point of it. And I think people were starting to see that now. And I think realizing with that comment and some other comments that we've got about kind of engaging with the horror genre, of pushing that envelope more, of being like, horror isn't trash, horror is art, horror is entertaining, it can be fun, it can be sad, it can be heartwarming, it can be so many other things other than just like exploitative rubbish. And that really meant a lot, I think. I've focused very much on one comment, but it's one that really blew me away recently. But yes, I'd say that's been a very big moment of realizing that the game is out there with actual people who are playing it, and it's actually making an impact.
I'm very fascinated by that perspective, because I could not agree with what you said more. As a person who's a lifelong horror fan, it feels like yesterday it started being taken seriously. Right. And now the groundwork was set when we started seeing the fiction started to be taken seriously, where people started looking at horror fiction and going, wow, this is like, there's stuff going on here. And, it became mainstream, and, Clive Barker, people who are not horror readers reading Stephen King and Clive Barker and starting to realize that there's a purpose to these types of stories. And then, just recently with Jordan Peele's work, that people, it's being lauded as, great work. And what was frustrating is you and I might sit down and have a couple of pints and talk about Halloween for 6 hours and what an incredible layered movie that is. But people think about Friday the 13th Part 4. I'm like, no, that's like, just like in everything, there's a lot of garbage out there. Right. But where that you don't have that garbage without things like Halloween, which is an incredibly layered, heavy commentary movie, and I'm a big John Carpenter fan. So I think the same thing about The Thing, right? The Thing works on so many different levels, and it's a story and a theme that could only be told in this genre to make that effective. But I guess I'd never really thought about it, as changing recently. Like the stuff coming out of Korea, I think has had an impact too, where people are starting to really realize what's possible with it. So you talk about this kind of two groups of people that love Shiver. And do you feel like you are exposing a lot of new people to this hobby through the game? Are there a lot of horror fans that have found Shiver that really knew nothing about role playing?
I think so. I'd say that because I think there is some crossover, but the thing I've noticed is, and I'm definitely hoping we can kind of continue, is that with the kind of meteoric rise that D&D is seen as well, like off the back of Stranger Things, and funnily enough, off the back of horror media. Just gonna throw that out there.
I love you.
People are kind of waking up to it being like a broader hobby and are kind of investigating it a little bit. But also at the same time, we're having a real renaissance with horror of it having a huge reevaluation. And you have much younger fans who are watching Stranger Things, essentially a horror TV show. And also kind of all these other horror films that are coming out are getting kind of critical praise. And also this thing of like, oh, there is this tabletop sphere that is a hobby that is growing like quickly. And they're kind of approaching things, but they're people who've not played D&D before, or potentially played it once or twice and are struggling with it, or maybe they've tried Call of Cthulhu or something else. And we're getting a lot of people who have tried other systems first, because they are the loudest noise on the market. There's nothing, our core team is 3 people, with now like kind of some extra part-time people, maybe making it up to about 4. We can't shout as loud as wizards, fundamentally. And so that is always going to be the first place where they interact with the hobby. But as I kind of said earlier, it's not always the most beginner-friendly point for every kind of person. And quite a lot of them, they're looking to, can I use this system to play X? Like, I want to play Halloween. And at the moment, and what we're finding is that eventually people are finding us getting the quick start or buying the core rule book. They put on a game of Halloween and it works, and they absolutely love it. And they really, because they finally have found something in this new hobby that's theirs, that resonates with the thing that they love most that they can do. and also because the game setting agnostic, it doesn't hem them into the set IP. I mean, like with the Gothic expansions, we're offering it if people want it, but also being like, tear it apart, do what you want with it. I don't mind. Like it is. I want people, if somebody wants to grab that Gothic book and basically play every single Universal Monsters movie, that's literally what it's designed for. It's because I love those films. I love Hammer horror, and that is my love letter to that. And I've written, a big story for it if you want to play it. But ultimately, all the mechanics, all those elements are there that you can just tear out and do your own thing with. And that's for me, the beauty of RPGs. And I think it's empowering a lot of younger, newer players who are interacting with the hobby through a different lens now, on this new wave and jumping on, because it is, I'd like to feel, very, very beginner friendly, by design, because ultimately RPGs have been fantastic for me. They've really allowed me to kind of express myself in a very unique way that I don't think I really had before, in terms of kind of like the limitations of the film industry, and that it's a little bit of a pay to play system, and if you're not rich, it can get quite tricky, or very, very slow, and your voice kind of dies away. With this, I can write something, I can run a game, I can tell a story, have fun with friends, and kind of feel heard. And I think a lot of other people are having that experience too, with RPGs. And now finding it a lot easier to do that. And we're trying to provide basically an access point for as many people, no matter whether you love numbers, whether you hate them, whether you've never played an RPG before, whether you're an actor, whether you've never acted before in your life, to just jump in and give it a go, and just providing as much to make it as easy and smooth as possible to give it a try. Because the more people playing the hobby, the better. Basically.
Exactly. And a credit to you and your brother, the system doesn't fight you along the way, which I think is really important, which is really kind of what we're talking about here, right? Is something that is built, it's built to tell a specific kind of story, and it doesn't fight you along the way. Which gets into, and this would be a whole nother podcast, well, why don't I just do that with D&D arguments that you hear about all the time? And that's people not quite understanding that system does matter. And I think Shiver is a perfect example of how it can matter and why it matters. So guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, I'm going to talk about 2 other books that I backed the day it was announced. We're going to talk about Double Feature. We'll be right back.
This is Sean. You may have heard of me from such movies as Brett and Sean Go to Illinois, 2 Motorcycles, 1 Stick of Dynamite, and Gaming and BS. What kind of RPG podcast is that? After my NFTs were stolen, I decided to become a patron of Third Floor Wars. The content is great, and it costs me less than a good shot of liquor. So consider becoming a patron. It may just land you your next big role. Head over to patreon.com/Third Floor Wars. Tell Craig Sean sent ya.
So obviously, if everybody's listening has figured out I'm a fan, right? How big of a fan am I? I back. So like I said, I missed the original Kickstarter. I back it and buy the whole kit and caboodle when the Gothic thing comes out, right? Which hasn't fulfilled yet, but you're not behind or anything. That's just, that I knew that when I backed it. And then you put out another Kickstarter, but this wasn't through Kickstarter. This was through GameFound.
It was, yes. Yeah, that's through GameFound.
So what do I do? Having not played the game yet, I back that as fast as I possibly can. So I want to talk very quickly about Double Feature, because again, I got to give you credit. You guys do a very good job of saying, look, this is specific. This is what this does. And you just keep ringing my bell over and over again. So Double Feature, take a trip to the movies with the award-winning Shiver RPG. Create your movie stars and play your favorite big screen hits with Shiver Blockbuster, or try to survive the night in your horror movie with Shiver Slasher. I want to start with Shiver Slasher because I think it ties a little bit to what we were talking about at the end of last segment. Yeah. When did the first thought come into your head that I think I want a book about this very specific genre?
Oh, I'm not going to lie. I think it was probably after the first book, the core rule book funded. We we kind of sat down kind of maybe a month after, a little bit shaky because it blew up way more than we expected, because it was the first game we'd ever done.
Yeah.
And started kind of talking about, okay, so Gothic came out, so the one in the middle, as it were, came from, that was the home game that I was running, was my Love Letter to Hammer Horror, is I was running that as a regular way to test new little mechanics and dropping them in, of just micro-testing abilities, throwing somebody an item that works in a certain way to test a certain mechanic, but developing that world. And then ultimately my brother said to me, I was like, oh, maybe we should do slasher or do X or Y. So basically I've got a book of about 40 Shiver : subgenre that is kind of all logged somewhere with ideas kind of underneath them. And I was like, oh, we could do slasher, or we could do this, or we could do that. But then he said kind of like, Gothic's got a lot of work already done on it. I like what you're doing it. Let's do that next, as I think that will go down really well. And he was not wrong. But slasher has a special place in my heart. It is kind of, I've always, and people have heard me probably say this in other interviews and things, but I'll say it again because I think it's worth repeating, is that in my view, horror is a broad church. But with slashers kind of like the Catholic Church. It's a big chunk of it in terms of the horror community. It's pretty dominant. Like when you think of horror, you think of Ghostface, you think of Michael Myers, you think of Freddy Krueger. You can't get away from it. And there is so much, like I grew up on slashers. I developed a deep love for them when I was at university, when I started playing role-playing. So they started to mingle together. I tried to create Jason Voorhees in D&D, which was hilarious, having players running around a swamp, being stalked by a large man with a knife. But yeah, so it was one I always wanted to do. And it was always on the cards. And it was like very much, we had like a tiering list of, once we decided on doing Gothic, after that we were like, right, where do we want, we've got that now set in stone. Mm-hmm. Where would we like to go after that? And kind of like just started thinking about it, and instantly I was like, slasher has to be the next one. It's literally horror. It's the queen and kings of horror. Right. Like you can't really avoid it. And Barney agreed, but interestingly wanted to pair it with something else for a very specific reason.
So question for you. And it's going to sound like a smart ass question, and that's slightly on purpose. Why can't I just do slasher with Shiver? Why do I need slasher? What does slasher give me?
You can. So this thing is like, you can ultimately play. I'd be a liar if I said you couldn't run slashers in the core rulebook, and there is a section for it in terms of the monsters that are there. The thing that's new with slashers is that, again, it's a love letter to that area of the subgenre, but also provides new mechanics for how to run slashers, how to design slashers. The key to, we delve a bit more into designing unique reaction tables as well. So there's an element of design, as well as a whole host of very unique slashers. But the thing that we have with this is that we introduced a whole new system called the inheritance system. And this has been based off of what's been happening in horror historically, but also quite recently. So this, I'd be remiss not to mention is that, like, this is probably around, like, once we'd figured this out, I brought on Adam Holloway, who is our new writer, who's been working with us for a while. So Adam and I trained together doing script writing, and he was the man I went to for slashers. He was the slasher king. He knew everything about slashers, and he basically educated me about slashers. Wow. And we kind of delved really deep into it, watched all the Friday 13th and went really crazy and found very niche, like, Canucksploitation ones and all sorts. Like, we went pretty wild. And I kind of knew that, because we were looking to bring on to expand the team anyway. I knew I have an idea of what I want to do with this mechanically. But in terms of story, in terms of time and balancing things, we would need to bring a new writer anyway. So I brought on Adam and being like, I have an idea of something I want to do, but I think you'd be great for writing the story side of this. And I was like, okay. So I brought him in and I explained what I wanted to do with it mechanically, which is with the inheritance system. The idea is that slashers are famous for the amount of sequels that they generate. And my idea with this is that they're also extremely lethal. So the likelihood that your character is going to die is quite high, and usually, there's the whole final girl syndrome. Like it's a thing. There might only be one survivor. But what happens if you want to tell an interconnected story, tell a sequel, and make the characters that you're building in your next story resonate with the ones that came before? And that's where the inheritance system came in. And Adam actually put a really good term for like what's happened with the Halloween films recently, as he called them requels, because of where they sit.
Interesting.
They shred past the first Carpenter Halloween, they shred the rest, and they place it in, and they basically do a sequel that reversions stuff by taking stuff out. And there is an element of older characters coming back, and it focusing on the knock-on effects that the event and their lives therefore have had on other characters. And really where this comes down to is Laurie Strode's impact on her daughter and her granddaughter in terms of these skills, but also the trauma that she passes onto them generationally. So this is where the kind of the inheritance system comes from. Of that, the idea is that if your character dies, so say Laurie Strode gets killed, and in the next game, right, my character's died. I need someone who is going to inherit my legacy, whether that is a family member, a daughter, a sibling, or a friend. In a ways, it doesn't have to be a genetic family. It can be chosen family as well. That inherits elements of my character. So in this can be anything from, quite literally, the machete they killed the slasher with. It can be very physical. Or in Laurie's case, it could be the time she spent with her daughter or granddaughter teaching them to hunt, for example. So it can be a core memory that manifests as an ability, as a skill, as experience that is valuable in terms of surviving. But there's always a double-edged sword element to this, of that these characters are coming out of these situations, they're alive, but they are damaged. There are issues there. There are traumas that trickle down, whether it is being hyper paranoid about who you trust because the killer turned out to be one of their best friends, or whether you kind of basically tell your granddaughter the story of the boogeyman every night and terrify the crap out of them to the rest of their lives. So they have this residual trauma that's passed down, because generational trauma is, I think, something that's not really talked about, but is a huge theme within slasher films. Of that there is this element of a haunt in Halloween in particular, like a haunting evil that has limpited itself onto someone for some reason that's not always clear, or intentionally left vague. And this is something that I kind of realize it's not just slasher films. Like this happens, like ghost films, haunting films, exorcism, like all of this. Like there are patterns of generational trauma and kind of the hand-me-downs of sins of the past. But for slasher is the archetypal genre, subgenre in horror that deals with this the most. So it was figuring out, how do we take that? How do we add mechanics to it? How do we add mechanics that resonate with character and make the stories enriched? Because there's whole sections about being like, you can inherit this stuff, but like you can be good friends with the person who is passed on. You can hate their guts. You can have like a tenuous relationship. Like Laurie Strode and her daughter, they do not get on.
Right.
They don't see one another in the first Halloween. I mean, I won't comment on the other two because they are. Yeah, I'm not gonna put my head in that hornet's nest because I'll upset people no matter what I say. So we'll leave that alone. We'll do the first one. Brilliant. And I'm using that as the archetypal element of what a requel is. So the way that manifests is you take those and you move that character forwards.
That's cool.
And then obviously if your character is the sole survivor and you move forwards, then you kind of gain the kind of traumas and things that are in the core rulebook as well anyway, and can play around with in a different way. And the way that that's manifested, what we've attached that to, is what I pitched to Adam of what I wanted to use it for, was to tell a multi-generational story that starts early 1900s and finishes now. And it's like, and I was like, how do we do that? Let's think like how do we tie it together? So ultimately what's manifested is as a prequel story with a couple of generations, 3 generations back ancestors in like the 1920s. Funnily enough, at the birth of talkie cinema is where we go with it. And then from there, we kind of explore the decades from, we do like the 50s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, and kind of now with our starter adventure exploring the 70s, which we talk about how you can slot that in. And all of those stories you can play as individual slasher movies, but the way we recommend doing it is they actually all interconnect. There is a large connecting narrative that even though the slashers are different, there is a thread. There is something that ties them all together. There is a core mystery that links them all together. Because although the evil may take a different shape, the influx of what's pushing it forwards, what's driving it, is always there, is always a constant in different forms, different ways, and in different modes of participation with how the story is operating. Trying to explain it without spoiling it, which is very difficult sometimes.
That was well done.
But that's it. Yes. But that's it. Ultimately, it's like if you want to play a story where you're a kid in the 1950s, like in a favorite Stephen King story, you're like a teenager surviving bullies and also a giant anthropomorphized chipmunk with an axe, but then survive 5 slasher movies to be an OAP, like a 80-year-old person with a Zimmer frame, hitting Michael Myers with it, whilst moving at the slowest of speeds. That's my dream of basically being like the kid who survived in the first film and somehow manages to make it all the way to the end. Ironically, not using the inheritance system, but the idea is that it's there as a backup.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, that story of what does horror mean to people at different ages as they grow through different horrific events? How do they change? How do they grow? How do they approach it as characters? And what does that do to the players who are playing as them? How does it change their thought process? So that's slasher in terms of how it works.
And we'll talk about the other book here in just a second. But before we do that, up to this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like, you and Barney have been kind of doing this. You have freelancers that have been helping you, but you guys are the core. But it also sounds like you and your brother have kind of your lanes, right? He does what he's very good at. You do what you're very good at. And you look over the wall at each other and help each other out. But now it sounds like we have Adam merging into your lane a little bit, and this now becoming a far more collaborative process for you maybe than it was in the earlier books. What was that like for you?
Not massively different. So it's interesting with Barney because I think there is it's a slightly different relationship. So I'll just explain kind of how me and Barney operate kind of now and before. Of that, Barney, although he dominates more of the business side of the company, he will weigh in on creative stuff when because he's acted as my editor basically and checking stuff over. Massive in terms of like from being a competitive Magic player, balancing rules and making sure things mechanically sing is without Barney the rules I think would be nowhere near as tight as they are, because that's something he's very, very good at and is just very good at kind of keeping me in check of being like, this is fun, develop this more, or this is a bit too silly, maybe rein it back, or this is too gory, this is too it kind of like he's a very good he always has been like a very good tone modulator of being like, nice. I think this needs a bit more, this needs a little bit more. So he's kind of constantly riding the faders on kind of like mixing kind of Shiver to make sure every part of it's singing at the right volume and feeling really, really good. And that's kind of always been our relationship kind of with it, and him kind of giving me creative feedback. With Adam, we already have a history of working together. So like when we were at university, like we collaborated on scripts. We're used to breaking stories, like we used to be in seminars and stuff together where literally we'd have to break down films, break down pitches, pitch stuff together, work on projects together. And so creatively we've had that relationship in a different sphere already. And the way that we approach this is like with Slasher is that I gave him the overarching structure, the mechanics. I said, what I'd like you to do is basically, these are the time periods we want to cover. Pitch them to us. We'll select which ones are stronger, and then and then dug into them together a bit of like, okay, how do we connect these together? Like kind of like, what do we do? And then Adam came up with some stuff and then we were like, that's it. That's the innocent, like that's the character that solves this issue. That's what ties it all together. And then started a back and forth, but a lot of it really coming from Adam interacting with the stuff we were putting in front of him of being like, this is kind of how the system and stuff is actually going to work. And until eventually we kind of had this big spider's web of a story that kind of connects all together, and playing around with it. And just so in this case, the relationship has changed with that. For Adam, I'm more on the mechanical side, but there is the tone modulator and the editor, maybe a little bit more involved than Bonnie is creatively, just because obviously it's more my background. So I will probably, I have sometimes heavier rewriting notes on certain bits and being of like where I want to tie things together a bit more, of it being like, if we do this, let's try that and play around. But in terms of the stories and the monstrosities that have come out of Slasher, they are all out of Adam's brain. I mean, like a fun story for the 1980 segment is the story's called The Curse of the Owl Man. And that is I don't think you'll mind me saying this, that was his final year script when we were at university.
Get out of here.
That I read, and he wasn't massively confident about, bless him, but I absolutely fucking loved. As well as he had another bit of kind of like video nasties of like these basic like cursed videotapes where things kind of like come alive. And I was like, I really like that idea. Do you want to pitch some of those creatures, and maybe this is a way that we can get like these things that are in your head in a connected way that people can enjoy in a different way? And he took that and he ran with it in ways that I expected, ways that I didn't expect, and just created these fascinating, as well as new stuff as well. Like not all the stuff kind of came from there. Like I think one or two things really kind of came from that. Owlman in particular was the big one, because I was like, that's the one I wanted you to start with, because it's the one that I've read and I know that it's good, and it will demonstrate to my brother like what we're on about, because obviously he wasn't as ingrained in like slashers as we were. So I think and then as soon as he read that one, he was like, I get it, that like I'm here now, I'm seeing what you're doing. So it was kind of almost, I already knew kind of Adam's like talent for storytelling, especially in that subgenre. It was just a matter of kind of, how do we take the ideas that are in your brain, and rather than have it as a film narrative, create a Ludo narrative that sings with people. And I think slashers are perfect for games, because like we were saying, in terms of when you're writing game stories, they're very they're absent of protagonist, in terms of there is a void there that's being played by the players. And it's something I didn't say before, but it ultimately makes a lot of stories when you're writing RPGs are antagonist led. They are antagonist focused, because they are ultimately the objective that needs to be defeated, overcome, or escaped. And that's where you start really when writing. Because, but usually the other way around is true for novels. And I think you start with the protagonist, usually, and figure out what they want and what they need, and then the antagonist comes out of that to represent that character's internal struggle externally in horror. With this, you don't know what you don't know what fears and what problems the players are going to bring into the game. So it's kind of creating something that is a more broader problem, but you know that the players will relate to and will understand, and is more of and will kind of speak to them in different ways. So it's very antagonist focused, and I know and Adam, I think, really ran with that, because he loves his slashers, loves building them, loves designing them, and giving them interesting, unique, and often quite sad stories as to why they exist and why they're the way that they are, which motivates the players, that void that our players are filling forwards in the narrative.
So we talked about earlier in an earlier segment, Charlie, how, you came in doe-eyed and fresh, right? And didn't come with some of the baggage, right? That some designers do, because they've read, 15 versions of Traveller. Now he comes in and he's the new Charlie, right? So you're now the neckbeard who has been far more experienced in writing games, and you have a new voice that comes in. Can you think of something that he brought in because he didn't know any better and you fell in love with it? Was there something really fresh that you saw him do because this was his first time writing role-playing?
Yes, he took because he'd read the other books as well, and Adam, just to explain, was also part of that D&D group that I introduced D&D to. Adam was there, And then also Adam he ran a Call of Cthulhu game for us, which hands down still one of the best RPG games I've ever played.
Oh, that's great.
Because the story he told was just amazing. It was just brilliant. It was so much fun. So I knew definitely he had it kind of in him, as it were, to kind of write this stuff. In terms of interesting stuff that he brought, Adam, like me, has quite a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. Adam, I think, is sometimes willing to go a little darker than I am, which I think is what Slasher needed.
Right.
But would often be like, is this too dark? Would be a question I would get. And I would respond, no, pull on that thread and keep going, because it's not always where my brain automatically goes. But for Adam, he's more ingrained kind of in that subgenre and wants to play and wants to play around in a darker sandpit sometimes. There's still a hell of a lot of humor. The man like me loves a pun. But I think like that was a big thing of like that lack of fear to kind of go dark with things.
Mm-hmm.
I think somewhere where we both line up is that we ultimately feel really bad for antagonists, and ultimately they're quite often tragic. Like I really like monsters, and I think they get a rough rap. I always tended to associate more with them when I was a kid than I did with the jock.
Those are the ones that have endured, though, Charlie. When you think about, in the annals of horror, the movies, the books and stuff that endured are the ones where we understood the antagonist, we understood the monster, and there was a layer and depth to them that allowed it to last as long as it did. It's neat to have Adam bring, especially in light of you saying, some of the criticisms is, we watch your actual plays and how do I do this seriously? And then we see Adam come in and go, oh, let me show you. Let me show you how dark we can go with this, which is fun. But now my next question, Charlie, is now we're going to throw the whole genre away. That is the structure behind this. And we get into Blockbuster. So where does Blockbuster come from?
So Blockbuster comes from my feeling that people don't realize how much horror is in the media that they consume.
Interesting.
Sounds weird, but I'll explain. So a lot of people be like, oh, I love Jurassic Park as a film. And it's just being like, it's like, oh, you can play that with Shiver. That's a horror film. And the response I've got, what are you talking about? Jurassic Park's not a horror film. And it's like, and it's ultimately, they're wrong. It's Jurassic Park. 100% is a hubris-filled slice of horror. It is mankind getting royally messed over by nature, which they shouldn't have touched, is ultimately what that story is. And I watched that when I was sub 10 years old. The Velociraptors, one of the best kind of slasher villains, really, in a way as well, of horror of all time for me. Like the T-Rex coming out of the paddock, the level of tension, of horror, of a big roaring monster that quite literally shouldn't exist in that time period, ravaging its way through and swallowing a lawyer, is huge. Like the impact it had on me, I think, as a kid, that was like probably one of the earliest horror films I saw. That and the 90s Mummy. But that's a whole other branch of obsession that kind of feeds into Blockbuster as well, but in a slightly different way. But so I think there's this interesting thing that I was experiencing. I saw this at university as well, is that people had this weird denial of that horror existed in the things that they liked. So my whole kind of quest with Blockbuster is kind of being like, well, if you love those movies, you can play them. And they are horror movies, but they don't have to feel the way that you think horror is. And that's the key. It's Blockbuster is a weird mission for me to explain to people that being like, Blockbusters can have horror in them. It doesn't mean it's horror that the way you think horror is. It's the way that, so like ones that we quote in terms of like what we're trying to replicate are films that I feel do this really, really well. So The Mummy, for example, has this element of like pulp mixed with horror, and pulp, like comics and books, had tons of horror and blood and scary moments in them anyway, but they've kind of got cornered off kind of into pulp. And Indiana Jones definitely comes in there as well. That was another big one for me as a kid. I use the way of describing it is that it's a very specific brand of horror that I'm trying to talk about with Blockbuster, and I labelled it Spielbergian peril.
Nice.
Is how I try to explain it. Of that, it's very bloodless, but the level of tension, the level of pure like kind of spectacle based, just jaw dropping. Oh god, this is a bad situation, and I'm in it, and I need to get out of it. Is very overwhelming. Like Jaws is one that I watched when I was very young as well. God. And kind of again like relatively not a super gory film really, but the build up it made me not want to swim for months. And it's kind of like, how do you achieve that, and how do you change people's perceptions? Because I think Jaws is an interesting one, because that's the one where people know it's a horror film, but it's the one that they've watched, and it's kind of like why, and it's the element of that is that it's actually absent of a lot of the tentpole elements that people who say they don't like horror, it doesn't have them. So it's not overly gory. It's not overly like in your face with jump scares. It's good at building tension slowly. It has quite in-depth characters that you really kind of grow attached to. It's not like certain slashers of the era where it is just a cavalcade of death of people that you don't really care about. For some of the, by the time you've got into the sequel chains, where you're finding characters are becoming more disposable, which, because I think that's quite often the problem. Like you said, people think about Friday the 13th 4 rather than 1 and 2, and it's kind of like that's the kind of issue that you're kind of up against. But then they attribute that to everything. So with Blockbuster, the idea of it is being like, it's giving people access to higher octane, higher action stories that have elements of big cinematic spectacle, make you feel more like a hero, I would say, to kind of encourage people to kind of cross over into the line, but also show that like you can pepper some horror in there too, and it makes it a lot more fun when your characters actually feel like they're in danger. And the fact that, and showing people that horror can be very different shades of blood red if you want it to be. It's very different in terms of how you approach it. So in terms of like ones that we've got in there, so we've got one that's a bit like Jaws, but it's, not to spoil it, blends with a very different movie, also a Spielberg movie, in a very interesting way. I won't spoil what that one is. Then we have our own take on a tongue-in-cheek Medieval Dead, which is a group of interns at the Adventurers League. Basically all the heroes are dead, and they're the only ones left. So taking of our love of me and Adam love the Evil Dead films. So it's kind of like, what if you took a classic D&D style story, but Army of Darknessed it, and made the characters hyper inexperienced, and that's the horror of actually they're being given something that's meant to be for a level 15 hero when they're level 1. Is the idea, but leaning into that and being like, how do they solve those problems? What problem or solutions come forward in the narrative that are a bit more unique? Then we have our pirate story, one of my personal favorites, because particularly the first one, the first Pirates of the Caribbean, has so much horror in it that people do not talk about. Of that, like the Ghost Pirates, in terms of how their design, the effects of the kind of CG, of like how they actually put those together, are scary. Like they do have that, like that they have like this grossness, this horror to them that isn't overwhelming, but is still has that element of fear and the supernatural to it. So that's there. There's also our take on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which is has some slight because I remember watching that as a kid and finding it terrifying, of being like, I know if I was a size of a thumb and faced off against a spider, it would blow my tiny little mind. Like when I was 8, I'd be scared out of my wits. And playing around with that, and that's like your family going to go visit, is kind of like your your granddad is kind of like a nice version of Rick from Rick and Morty and has managed to shrink himself rather than turn himself into a pickle. And you accidentally get shrunk by a evil council of toys. So it's also taking the scary part that I found in Toy Story, which scarred me as a child, with the misfit toys. Jesus Christ. Yeah, that got me. As well as I realize I'm just listing stuff now, but like that's the essence of it, of taking stuff from media that I loved, especially from that nostalgic era of being a kid where that element of peril could still like basically like scare me but not traumatize me. And I think that's the thing, is that like it's this interesting thing for a lot of people who don't think that they like horror. And I say don't think they like horror because I think they actually do. And they have a whole other thing of that, like kids actually like to be scared. Let your kids watch scary movies. Yes. Just pick them carefully is what I would say. And this is kind of what Blockbuster's about, of being, it's okay to be scared in a fun way. And it can actually educate you kind of more in terms of that, like not all elements of horror are bad, and it's very broad, the spectrum that you can experience it on. So rather than going, no, horror is bad, it's not something I want to experience at all, it's kind of like, how about this entry point here, which is like X, Y, and Z. So it's using that pop culture language that people have now, because a lot more people are way more pop culture literate now than they were 20 years ago, to put people at ease and ease them in. And actually, again, there's this element of like validifying horror as a genre and its presence in other medias and other works, that it is there. It is something you enjoy, and it's not something to be get back ashamed of, not something I want to interact with in any way. So so that's Blockbuster in terms of why it exists.
I love it when a guest tells me something I always knew but I'd never heard before. And that's exactly what just happened. And as you were talking, Charlie, I was thinking, I'm like, holy shit, like he's right. Like there's more horror than I've ever realized. And a lot of the movies that are not genre horror that I love, I think about the elements or the techniques of horror that are in that. And I immediately went to Die Hard, right? For me, which is the quintessential, because of how old I am, the quintessential blockbuster movie. And I was thinking like the idea of taking away the tools, restricting the choices, whittling them down. I mean, that's all horror tropes, right? That's what you do to your protagonist in these slasher type movies, especially, is exactly what happens in Die Hard. And I've never thought about how many of those elements we see in things like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids or Toy Story 2. So well done, man. I never really quite thought of it that way. And it makes me understand Blockbuster a little bit more, right? That connective tissue for you creatively. And I kind of get a kick, Charlie, out of the fact that you're seeing some of this work as you also making a statement and pushing some thoughts that you had and using the role-playing game as a method of pushing that through, which it sounds like was something that was maybe frustrating for you as a screenwriter, that you had these ideas, these things to say, and they just weren't getting out there. Am I capturing that? Yeah,
I think it was less kind of stuff getting out there, but I think bar a few others, like there was definitely silos within the course that I was on who were very much in like horror is trash.
Right.
Like Spielberg films aren't art, like broad media isn't something that we should be basing our artistic integrity or goals off of. And for my question to them was, why not? They're some of the most successful films out there in terms of money, but that's not the point. It's the fact that people have showed up, put their bums in their seats to watch those films and have enjoyed them again and again and again and again. And I can't say that about a lot of the media that they're talking about. It pushed the envelope and moved the medium forwards, but ultimately I think there is a lot of merit to not forgetting and not to basically crap on other media for doing what it's intending to do, which is entertain people's bloody socks off, and saying that certain corners of that, like using horror techniques, is trashy and cheap. And it's like, no, people like being scared. It's like people don't throw out the same criticism about going to roller coasters or theme parks or people seeking those thrills. And I find going and sitting in a cinema seat with a bunch of people very much being like on a roller coaster, where part of the joy is watching everyone else scream as well as yourself. is that horror is one of the few genres I like to go to a fully packed cinema and watch, because having an audience there amplifies it. And comedy is actually quite similar, I find. And it's fascinating to me that no other genre works that way. Like a big budget like adventure movie or a superhero movie, I go watch it by myself. I prefer to, or drama, I'd rather go and watch that by myself. But horror, I'm getting 10 people with me and we're going together, because it's experiential in a different way, because it is so evocative of a certain emotion. You're trying to horrify, you're trying to prod and poke and get a reaction out of people, which is why kind of comedy and horror are always such big bedfellows of that. Basically, horror is basically comedy. It's like telling a joke, but the punchline's different. It's like you're not trying to make somebody try to laugh, you're trying to make them scream. That's horror. That's all it is. The structure is exactly the same. Hence why I think Jordan Peele was such a great filmmaker. He started in comedy, and you could see those undercurrents and love for horror, but he already has the structural knowledge of what it takes to do both. And hence why everything he makes at the moment is just an absolute hit in my book, because he understands structurally kind of what he's trying to evoke and also layers in the message. But I'm getting a bit off-piste there. But but that's my general feeling about it. Is it's, I don't want to say it's like an education tool, but it's just kind of showing people what's already there and just being like, but you enjoy this though. Like it's okay. It's like, this isn't going to be, not every horror movie is Saw. Right. Because I think this is the thing, is that people hear horror and they think of sensationalized elements of media that they know they associate with horror films. And then the end point of that argument in their own head is that every horror movie must be like the thing I have seen that is causing people to faint in the cinemas, or is being banned, or is causing an issue, or, you know, is somebody's arbitrarily linked to some horrible event. That is the perception that I would like to change. I don't know how successful we'll be with doing that with a game. I really hope it helps. But I have a discussion about Stranger Things with my friends as well. Is that loads of people are just being like, oh, I don't really like horror. It's like, but you like Stranger Things, don't you? It's like, yeah. So you remember like when like the characters get floated in the air and literally all their bones break? So what
the flower face monster?
It's like what is Stranger Things then in terms of its genre? Right. It's like, well, I guess it's horror. It's like, there you go. It's people don't know. It's almost like horror's like ice cream, but they only think that one flavor exists.
Right.
It's the thing. Everyone thinks it's pistachio, and he all bloody hates pistachio. And it's like, no, there is vanilla. You can have vanilla. That is a valid option. It's okay. It's like, please just trust me. Try vanilla. It's so like funny. You can start there and move up, and we can eventually get to pistachio if you'd like. But it's sorry, weird analogy, but it's
a good analogy. And I am God, you're going to evoke all kinds of stuff in me now. I'm going to go on a rant. Like I'm fighting this fight with my wife, right? So my wife, I hate science fiction, I hate horror, is where she is, right? But then I sit her down and she watches every episode of Stranger Things with me. And I just feel like going, aha, you know, and pointing at her and going, I told you this is good. But then we'll sit through a 7-episode, true crime. And I turn to her and go, honey, this is scarier than any horror that I was going to show you. Like, this is like, what are you talking about? Like, you do like this stuff, right? But you're right. There's this perception and this label that it has. And science fiction suffers from that a little bit too, though. We're seeing science fiction start to get its own kind of come up in its own way as well. So guys, we're going to take one more break. When we get back from this break, we're going to get to one of my favorite segments of my show, which is, what do people who create like to consume? We'll be right back.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Writer's Room, where you can find all sorts of adventures, antics, and escapades for the 7th Sea TTRPG. I'm Zoe Jackson.
I'm Evan Ackley.
And I am Patrick Keefe.
And we're here to tell you the stories of 7th Sea. If you enjoy actual play podcasts featuring adventure, drama, and swashbuckling heroism using music and dynamic sound effects, then you've come to the right place. Not only do we bring you stories from our 7th Sea gameplay, we also discuss the mechanics of the game in special episodes called Notes with the Narrator. To learn more, our Linktree link will be in the bio, and that will help you find us on your favorite podcatcher, as well as support us through our many different platforms. Won't you join us?
So I would say in the last year or so, Charlie, I've started doing this segment at the end because I find it really interesting. You know, you spend a lot of time making stuff for other people to consume. And, you know, you get the joy of finding that people have fell in love with it, right? That people are finding joy in something that you made. But I'm always interested, like, what's got its hooks into you? So is there something or a few things that have recently said, like, become an obsession? So this could be a video game you couldn't put down. This could be a show or a movie or something that you binge watched or a series of books. What recently has gotten its hooks into you and why?
Oh, it may be a bit cliche for the time at the moment, but the one that really got its hooks in me recently, because I was a massive fan of the first iteration as well, is God of War Ragnarok. The way
really?
There's something, I love horror, but I do love other stuff kind of more broadly.
Yeah.
And I won't spoil anything with it, because obviously I know it's a game that people desperately love and they really want to play, and not everyone started playing it yet. But so me and my friend Wallace, again, another screenwriter friend, talking about this, because he helped me with some proofreading for some of the stuff that we're doing, to kind of get stuff out quicker for reprints and things. And I gifted him the first 2018 God of War. He's been playing through that, and we've been having conversations about it. And we got this discussion of Ludo narrative in terms of like how gameplay influences story and how that you kind of have that loop. And God of War, honestly, hands down for 2018 and Ragnarok, is masterful in terms of how it blends so many different mediums when you actually think about it, in terms of the fact that the game is one single unbroken take when you actually think about it in terms of how it's made. Like, there are no breaks for cutscenes. The camera floats in the scene and never cuts for a 40+ hour experience.
Wow.
And that and actually gets the message of, like, when I watch a one take shot in I'm going to throw shade at it, 1917 and other things, I just feel like this is just flashy stuff to try and get awards. I'm not going to lie. But with God of War and with games, like, this unbroken take, this element of not cutting to break you out of the narrative, because ultimately when you're playing a game, you are the controller, you are throwing yourself into that character, and in terms of kind of Kratos, like, empathizing with that character as you're the one controlling them, it helps to kind of never break that link. And there's so many other elements that I won't get into in terms of, like, I'm a massive mythology nut as well. I love folklore. So those games are like absolute crack to me, because what they've managed to, it's like Norse mythology, for anyone who's into mythology will understand this. Norse mythology is super weird and has massive gaps in terms of the logic of how things happen. And what God of War managed to do with being a bit revisionist with certain elements has managed to successfully weave huge parts of that mythos, pantheon, and mythology together in a way that is satisfying and gives narrative, explanation, conclusion, and motivation to every corner of it, which to me is an absolute masterpiece. And it's, I think everyone kind of, you know, talks about the combat and how great it looks, and Kratos going boy like all the time, and people love those elements because they're fun. But I think the thing is that I just kind of sit back and I marvel at those two games together now as a partnership of, like, as just storytelling, of like character-driven storytelling, in terms of how, because it is a game where you can sit in a boat and a severed head will tell you stories from mythology for hours on end. It's a story about storytelling in a lot of ways. It's just crazy. I love it.
Oh, that's cool.
But that's so I'm shirting around it, because it's, I just, if I don't want to be the person who spoiled it for somebody, because I want someone to go in as blind as possible with that. So on the game front, that is something I'm playing a lot. I've just finished the second game and it's brilliant in terms of storytelling. In terms of TV, what I've been watching recently, Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities.
Yep.
I've watched all of that, consumed it, loved them all. I think as an anthology, it is one of the most fascinating anthologies that I've watched of that. It has that stamp and production value and practical edge that Del Toro brings to projects. I think he's bringing this as a producer. But all of them feel unique. They all have their own voice. They're all very individual. And I think it really, really works massively. I mean, like any anthology, there's certain ones I prefer, there's certain ones that I are least favorite, but honestly, it's if anything, that series is a real visual treat. I mean, Guillermo del Toro is he's an absolute hero of mine. Basically, in terms of like when I would still love to make a feature film someday, like if possible, but in terms of like people I idolized, like when training and when I was and still do kind of creatively, he is up there, like massively so. So I'd say in terms of kind of like TV screen media, that's what I've watched recently. What have I watched any films recently that I really, really liked?
Well, I'm going to hit you sideways. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Charlie.
I rated Barbarian. I'll throw that out there. I would say the film, go in blind, know nothing about it. That is the best way to experience that film. It's like if you are, is it like if you're not a horror fan, I would say it might be a bit rough. Is what I would say, but it's definitely worth your time. I enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah. I appreciated Barbarian more than I liked it, if that makes sense. So like I watched Barbarian and I was like, I really appreciate what this movie did. Not my favorite movie, but I really like it still stands. It stands as being a very important movie because of what it did and did it successfully. Right. So the fact that I had no issues with its execution or anything. There's certain premise things that just aren't me, but it pulled off something very, very hard to do. And I'm trying not to be spoiler either because I am jaded and it's tough. Yeah. It's tough for me to be like, oh, look at you. Look at what you just did. Well done. That's not easy to get that out for me. All right. So I'm going to hit you sideways as we finish up here, Charlie. And this is a very specific question based off of how much I've gotten to know you over the last 2 hours. I don't want to know your top 5 favorite horror movies. I don't want to know that. What I want to know is what you would consider in no particular order, the 5 most important horror movies. And I think that's different. In no particular order.
Okay. I'll tell you why, and I'll try and explain my thought process on it. So I'm going to throw The Thing in there. So The Thing is probably my favorite, but I think there is a reasoning for why it's important. It has the strong association of practical effects and kind of great horror, but it also is an exemplar of when I talk about horror, about what you can do. It has all the gooey creature effects, it has all the kind of horror intention, but it also has the fascinating social message, which was lost at the time that it was released, of that it is about the echoes of Cold War tension and people not being able to trust one another. And that was lost at the time, panned when it came out, but it now is so important because it sings for the revisionist place that we're in, that film is now looked back on as a masterpiece, as it rightfully should be. So I think kind of the Thing is an exemplar of kind of what I think is most important kind of there in terms of horror, of like where we have been, where we are, and also kind of what horror can do. I would say I think I'd be remiss not to mention Get Out. Because I think Get Out tipped the balance in terms of how people view horror, with very, very good reason, of tapping into, especially in America, a very kind of rightfully had societal fear that is kind of present and wasn't being talked about, and it opened the floodgates of introducing people to horror. But I think also as really society helped open the floodgates in terms of actually having that as that being an open conversation, of that being something that it is now just discussed. I mean, like you know, Get Out is referenced everywhere in terms of like to describe the mood, the feeling, the social kind of status of where an entire country is in terms of race relations, which is huge, and had a massive impact. And again, I think an exemplar of just being really just showing people that like horror isn't trash, like it wears its influences on its sleeves, and what's possible in terms of kind of pushing a social envelope. So I would say that would definitely be there. The others, this is where I'm really going to start to struggle in terms of, I know it's really going to have to recede into my brain of why I think they're important and not just pick something that I like, which is what makes this hard, but what makes it a very good question. Oh, it's a tough one. What else would I pick in terms of horror? What do I think is important? So I think for me, in terms of like kind of history of filmmaking, I'd say Halloween is probably one of the most important.
Could not agree more.
I think like Friday the 13th has its place, as does Nightmare and all the other slashers. But in terms of like, if you don't know the history of Halloween, in terms of like the scale of budget, the fact that they use Steadicam for the majority of the film for like the first time, they're almost like kind of beating Dark the Shining to the punch in terms of what they were doing, especially at something at that scale of a budget. Nobody thought it was going to be a hit. They tapped into, again, a feel this basically the death of the safety of suburban America. Of basically that serial killers had arrived. They'd only recently been named as actually being a thing. Like if you've watched Mindhunter, another great series that like delves into that, love it. But it was kind of like, I think the real start of that, especially in American cinema, I would say, for that one. I mean, I could go on in terms of like the impact of what that has. I'd say he is the grandfather of all slashers for good reason.
No question.
In my book,
created an entire genre of cinema.
Yes,
but did it? There's a lot of movies that followed that missed the point. Right. And to a certain degree, like you were talking about The Thing, so did we. It took time for us to really understand what Carpenter was doing and what Carpenter was saying. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen Precinct 13, which was technically Carpenter's first one. Holy crap. Like he was doing it back then, right? He had $5 to make that movie. And there are some themes in that movie that are important and only could be told the way he told it. So all right, so that's 3. You got 2 more, and maybe let's think about something like Halloween, where it really changed the game, right? Influenced, and we're still seeing the echoes of those movies now, or something new like Get Out that really just puts its foot down and says this is important.
So to kind of move away from, I think, kind of societal stuff, I think maybe in terms of style. I think I'll go throw in a bit of a curveball. And I'm going to say the German Expressionist movement in terms of like the art movement, because without the German Expressionist movement, you don't get off-kilter angles, the relationship between like light and shadow in this very strange and creepy way. You don't get this element of surrealism that has such a specific feel and taste to it. And without that, you don't get the universal horror films, which the German expression and cinema movement, in particular with like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you basically don't get James Whale. You don't get Frankenstein and Bride. You don't get any of that, not in the same way. And I feel, but in terms of like, if you're pulling on threads and you're going back to one place, rather than attribute it to one person, I would say it was an artistic movement in Germany that spawned that really moved horror forwards. And if you don't have that, then yeah, it's just not a thing. Or like horror does not look the same. It wouldn't look anything like none of the films we've just mentioned, I think, would be the same, which is fascinating. So I'd say like that artistic movement is like, if you're interested in the aesthetic of the universal horror films, I'd really recommend rewinding and looking at like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Der Golem, and all the various other things, as well as the paintings and artwork as well. It's the chain. And then if you like looking more on things, the end sequence to Near DaCosta's Candyman, produced by Jordan Peele, where you have the shadow puppetry at the end, all tracks back to German Expressionism. I did a lecture on this. I did a lecture on this for students before I left working for the university. So and like this being like kind of, because there's something I'd recommend, like if you want to kind of get into a creative field, is pull on your chains of influence, because ultimately, like if you like Del Toro, look at Del Toro stuff and look at what he likes. So for like that, for example, so I pulled on his stuff that he likes, and I found Eyes Without a Face, great French film, superbly creepy, odd kind of fairy tale. You pull on that, it unravels further, and eventually you get back in, and it can just keep going, and that's this kind of joy of it. But that's the way to discover other stuff that you can reinterpret in a way that's different to the people that you idolize, and find new stuff. So in terms of like a secondary element of that, that's something I did with horror movies and the Universal horror movies, and getting into German Expressionism and that kind of silent era of cinema, and that had a massive impact on me in terms of like how I approached things. So it's kind of a personal one as well, in terms of it kind of being important. It's important personally, but important to the history of horror as well. So yeah. So how many have I got? One more?
That's great. Yo, please.
One more. Let me see if I can think of one more. Oh, what's important? What is important to me? What is important to horror?
Well, scratch that in the back of your head for a second, Charlie. And I'm remembering something that we threw away at the very beginning. I think it was in the first segment that I want to come back to. We talked about, games. We talked about games that were like significant, right? And I asked that question, not realizing that you rolled right into Shiver, which was, like I said, usually not the normal path. But you made a bit of a comment that you said, but there's been games since Shiver that have had an impact on me. Can we quickly talk about that? What are some other RPGs out there that you have found significant for you, either as a player, as a GM, or as a creator? So the Call of Cthulhu game that I already referenced with Adam, I think that where he was our keeper, that had a massive impact in terms of kind of seeing what other people were doing in the space, for one. Playing around with a more crunchy system and realizing that for me as a player, I actually quite like crunchy systems when I play them. Like I don't mind them. Like it's something that I can kind of get on board with. And found it very interesting in terms of that. It just feels so different and archaic in a good way. Right. In terms of that, there is something very evocative of that being locked in that 1920s setting that it does so well, and really thrives in its niche, and I think should be extremely proud of that. Yeah. Which I really enjoyed. In terms of other ones that I've played, what other ones have I played that I would say I really enjoyed? So we've done Dread, we've done that one. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's one that's escaping me, and it's bugging me. I think it was it a 1-page one that I did. It'll come back to me. There's the ones that I haven't played, but I've read and been deeply impressed by, and kind of so kind of like when we developed the Doom Clock, one of the ones that when I was sort of just did that panicked thing of when you create something, you're being like, have I created something that already exists? Yep. Which is something that happens, and a lot of people, and I get this question a lot actually, so I thought I'd answer it now. Of people would be like, "Oh, did you get an idea from Blades in the Dark?" Is one that I get quite often about the Doom Clock, and I didn't know about it. So then I apparently bought the book and read it, and I love it. It's fascinating. It is again. I think it is, as you're kind of very kindly saying about Shiver. I think it was very similar to the feeling I had of reading something like that and just being like, I've not experienced or seen anything like this anywhere else in everything else that I've seen. Like this just feels like something else. I had the same reaction to Blades.
Like I love heists as well. I love heist movies with a deep passion, so that really spoke to me. Unfortunately with Blades, so I haven't played it because it's the thing. It was like it is one of those games that is fantastic in concept, but convincing people to play it, I find, is actually very difficult to get people onto it. Yeah,
it's funny you say that. So John's been on the show. He's been a good friend of the show, and I'm a huge fanboy of his work. But like you go back to if you've never read Lasers and Feelings, that's a 1-pager you need to grab that John made.
Yes, but, I've read Lasers and Feelings.
So good. Like nobody should be that good. What's interesting about Blades is a lot crunchier than it reads, and you don't realize that till you start playing it. And again, not a bad way, right? But I'll speak for myself. I went into Blades blindly. and started running it going, oh, wow, this is a little bit more interconnected. The gears are what I keep thinking about with Blades, where everything works together and it's a very much a tight machine. But yeah, it comes off as very loosey goosey light until you start playing it. And you do, I think to gronk it as a player, you do need a GM that is familiar with it. I think it can be very hard to play Blades if everybody at the table's new.
Yes.
So I'm with you on that one. Definitely with you.
So one that escaped me, that I have mixed feelings on, but I still love it. Is Monster of the Week.
Oh yeah.
So there it is a game that has prompted so many interesting design questions in my head from having played it quite a few times that I really enjoy, but also kind of start thinking about what kind of Ludo narrative actually works with this game, like kind of like what is the best thing to kind of play with it, because I love it. I love the ethos of it. Monster of the Week stuff is like what I consumed voraciously when I was younger. Like I grew up on Buffy. Like Buffy was just huge for me, and I rewatched it all like when I was kind of in university, and just realized how masterful of a show it is then when I can have more of a kind of critical brain whilst watching it. Monster of the Week I think poses really interesting questions of kind of like how do you approach a mystery game, and I think the playbook style I think is deeply accessible, which I really enjoy. But there is something that I kind of find quite interesting that I was finding in some of the games that we were playing, that it has. I don't know if this is going to speak to people, but I'll go down this rabbit hole anyway. So it's something that me and my friend Wallace discuss of what we call the iRobot problem, in terms of writing a mystery story. Of that, iRobot, the Will Smith film, just to clarify, not the Asimov story, has a bit of an issue in terms of how it structures, and this kind of comes from film nerdery about screenwriting, is that its whole mystery relies upon that Mr. Detective is the right question, which is a line that happened, and then it goes to the next bit of the mystery. And the thing that I was finding is that in terms of prep on the GM side, you were having to prepare for this big set list of questions, to make sure that you could kind of explore every avenue. But no matter what you did, some of those would always provide a dead end. And there was an element of that we found people running the game almost were trying to nudge players towards the right question to kind of keep narrative momentum going. And I think it's if you've got a role play heavy group, it's incredible. But if you have players there who aren't as role play active, it's kind of at what point does the structure of the question set dictate how the story progresses and moves? And this isn't me bashing it at all. I just find it fascinating of that, like, it really kind of lit my brain on fire of thinking like, this is doing something really interesting, very much like Blaze in the Dark, of being like the playbook system. Like and the first time I encountered that, is through Monster of the Week, is that kind of iteration of that system of kind of having narrative questions that move the story forward. I think is an excellent idea, and keeping things move and always kind of moving stuff forwards. But it's kind of almost the question about the questions is by being like, you can only ask these things. How much do you engage your story and your player's agency in terms of like, because they're only allowed to progress the game in a way that you already have a set answer for. So it's like, how does that work? So what does that do to a Ludo narrative when you apply it? So yeah. So in terms of, they're just very interesting. In terms of it made me think about how I design stories massively. Like it completely threw the book out the window, pulled it back in, glued extra bits in, and started playing around with that. So I was like, it's very useful, but can also generate problems. And it's like, how do you balance it? And a lot of the adventures that I've read for Monster of the Week like do a really good job of explaining that, and it's fascinating. Like when you dig into, when you look at the system and then you look at the stories designed for the system compared to people using the system without looking at stuff that people have designed to use with it, it's like that there's an interesting separation sometimes that goes on. But yeah, just this incredible and amazing system in terms of what it generates and what it creates, because ultimately that's what these games do, is they generate stories. They're story engines is what I would call them in a lot of ways. They're generating narratives, and mechanics often dictate, and I would say wholly dictate a lot of the time, how the pace, the style, and the shape of the stories that come out are actually made.
Well, Michael, what's interesting about Monster of the Week, I'm also a huge fan of that game. But there's a couple things that are interesting to me about it. One, it's powered by the apocalypse. So there's always a meta conversation that happens, right? It's the same type. You see Blades inherited that as well, right? Which is Blades is not powered by the apocalypse. It's kind of a distant cousin of it, right? But there's this meta conversation, which some players don't like having, right? They want full quote unquote immersion. I don't want to have a meta conversation. And with Powered by the Apocalypse, you have to. It's part of what's in the system. And people have to remember with Monster of the Week is it's one of the earliest Powered by the Apocalypse games. So Apocalypse World came out before Apocalypse World was released. Michael was working on Monster of the Week. So Monster of the Week is a very early iteration and it shows its age a little bit. But there's a long list of games that wouldn't exist without what Michael did in Monster of the Week, right? But here's where I'm going to point you to, and you may already know this game because I think this is, talk about the inheritance system. This is the great granddaughter of Monster of the Week, and it does some really interesting things. Have you read Brindlewood Bay yet from Jason Cordova?
No, but I'm very, very aware of it.
You need to fix that problem.
Of Lovecraft investigating grannies is like, speaks to my heart and soul. So yes, I'm very interested in it, but I've not read it yet. So yes, I will
go grab the PDF. And it's going to have a little bit of a Blades in the Dark impact on you, is my prediction, where you're going to read this and go, holy shit, like this is coming at things in a way that I'd not thought of. But I don't think that Brindlewood doesn't exist without Monster of the Week, right? But what Brindlewood does for mysteries is what John Harper did for heists. And it's really, really interesting. And the first time I read it, you and I are going to have a conversation after you read this, because I'm fascinated to hear which I bounced off of it. The first time I read it, I was like, what the hell is he even talking about in here? Like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. And then I went back and digested it and came back to it and go, holy shit, like this is incredible. So that's a whole conversation that we'll have someday about it, but go read it. And then when you read it, send me an email and say, hey, Craig, you're full of shit. It was garbage, or holy crap, Craig, you can tell me which way it was. Charlie, there's a million things you can do on a Sunday night, and it doesn't involve, wasting your time talking to me and my 4 listeners, but you did. And I want you to know how much I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. No, it's been an absolute delight. I think it's very lovely talking to someone who I can tell is evidently a fan not just of the hobby but the horror genre, and I think creativity overall. I think that's the thing, is that there's so many crossover points. I mean, like with this conversation we're having about different RPGs, it's like it is just this big chain of influence of that, like everyone's stuff is influenced off one another, and rather than people shaking the fist and being like, you copied this thing, or it's too much like this thing, which I think the community can sometimes be a little too quick to do. It's rather celebrate the fact that everyone is bouncing off each other's ideas and enjoying being in the hobby and trying to build new things. But you can't build things without a foundation. And I think there's a huge amount of joy of that, whether you pull on influences from cinema or you pull on influences from other games. It's always going to be there and be in the threads of kind of what you weave together. And I think that's always the joy of it.
I couldn't agree more. And, people that jump on that don't fully understand art, I don't think, and don't understand the creative process. I think people that do create understand how that works. We're not saying theft, right? That's different. Influence is unavoidable, right? Influence is unavoidable. So guys, everybody knows this already. Scroll down. I've got a long list of links that covers everything Charlie and I just talked about, especially where you can get your hands on Shiver. And all these other, the Gothic, the double feature, all of these other fun books that I could not throw money out of my pocket fast enough for. And of course, those of you that watch the Twitch channel know that once I do get my Kickstarter, one of the first things we'll do is, of course, have me run some Shiver on the channel. All right, Charlie, thanks again. And for those of you listening, this is the end. You listen to this whole thing, and I want you to know I appreciate you listening. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to Tabletop Talk and share it with your friends. Check out our content on YouTube and Twitch. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook and stay updated on everything coming from Third Floor. All the links are in the show notes. Take care, floorheads.
Oh, that's good. I'm going to drop the running a horror RPG segment because we kind of covered that in a lot of different ways. We kind of sprinkled it through this whole thing, which I really loved, Charlie. And now I'm going to give you a chance to talk about all this shit you like. So this will be short, 10 or okay. Well, no, we'll keep it 10-15 minutes. But then, either that, you'll put 3/4 in me and get me going. Yeah. But this has been gold, man. I cannot thank you enough.
Thank you. No, that's all right.
All right. I'll bring us back. That was one of the better segments ever on my show.
Oh wow, thank you. Yes.
That was really good.
I was really getting slightly worried. Charlie. I spiral off sometimes.
It's exactly what I was talking about before, Charlie. Before we started recording, is that that's where the magic happens on my show. Is when I'm able to tap into something that you're passionate about. And we get to hear your voice. So I really appreciate that. That was a really good segment. Really good segment.
My pleasure.
How are you? How are you on time? I'm good on time, but I don't want to tie you up. Are you okay for 2 more segments, or should we shorten it up?
I should be good for 2 more segments.
You okay?
That's all okay by me. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
No worries.
All right, my friend. Fantastic. Thank you.
No worries.
What I'm probably going to do, if it's okay with you, is talk about, maybe even pre-Shiver. Well, actually, that's what I'm going to find out here. So I want to find out what came first. My brother and I are going to make games together, or Shiver. So that's probably how I'll start this next segment, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Absolutely. That's absolutely fine.
Oh, hey, are you still here? Wow. Well, the episode is over, but if you're bored, why not go to patreon.com and support the show for as little as $1 a month? Yeah, you can just scroll down and get the link. It's Patreon that makes this and all of our other content possible. Don't you want to join the other floorheads on the Patreon Discord? Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Take care.